Hello, I'm Rico Rushworth, aka Record, musician and writer. I'm a literature major at UCSC, and I'm gonna read one of my favorite books, The Ghost of Graylock by Dan Daniel Poblocki. I think this is a great book when it comes to descriptions and visuals. I think it's really inspiring that way. I think for me as a literature major, I look up to the way that Dan Poblocki kind of creates visuals and describes things. I think that's really cool. So because of that, here is the full run of the book. The Ghost of Graylock, Dan Poblocki. There's a little dedication. Prologue. Every town has its share of secrets, and when whispered by children in the dead of night, some secrets become stories. They percolate and brew and change. Sometimes, under special circumstances, the stories become legends, destined to survive even as the children who share them grow up and move on. In a town called Hedston, a ruined building called Graylock Hall stood in the state forest like an enormous funeral monument. It had once been a notorious psychiatric hospital housing almost 1,000 patients. Local kids refer to it as the Asylum in the Woods, and most of them knew well enough to stay away. Since its closing, the secrets contained within the hospital's walls had given rise to a frightening legend of madness and murder. If you'd grown up nearby, the subject of that legend, a nurse who had worked the graveyard shift, would have haunted your nightmares from an early age. It started with a storm. Late one night, while the hospital was still in operation, the building lost electricity in the mists of a summer thunderstorm. During the blackout, one of the patients from the youth ward went missing. The next morning, the staff found the girl's body, drowned, bloated, and blue, face down in the reeds at the water's edge. Then, several months later, a second patient drowned. Another storm, another power outage. Some of Graylock's staff grew suspicious of the nurse who had been on duty during both accidents, but they said nothing. After a third drowning, the staff wished they hadn't kept their fears secret. 3 children lost, 3 bodies discovered at the water's edge, small limbs tangled in lakeweed, eyes staring blindly at the pale morning sky. The people of Hedston refused to believe that the deaths were a coincidence, and so they arrested the nurse who'd worked the graveyard shift, claiming that the madness of the place had infected her, that she had decided death was the only way to end the suffering of the children in her charge. To add to the townspeople's horror, a day after her arrest, the police discovered the nurse's body hanging from a bedsheet that she'd tied to the bars of her cell. With the nurse's death, the truth of the matter would remain a secret that became a story that became a legend. Within a few short years, the hospital was shut down. Graylock Hall was left to rot, but in the town of Hedston, the tale of Nurse Janet lived on. And they say that, inside the abandoned building, a woman in white still wanders the corridors, her thick-heeled shoes click-clacking against the tile as she follows at an arm's length behind anyone who dares intrude. When she catches you, she sticks you with her needle, then drags you outside to the water's edge, down to the deep tangles of clutching lakeweed. They say she smiles as she holds you under, her face blurred as you stare up through the silvery surface, her teeth glistening white. Delighted to continue her murderous quest to end the suffering of the insane. For who but those with their own touch of madness would dare enter the asylum in the woods and pursue? Part 1. Hideaway. Chapter 1. Sitting on the porch steps of his aunt's Victorian house, Neil Cady clutched a small satchel in his lap and waited for his new friend, Wesley Baptist, to arrive. Neil had found the bag at the back of the pantry in his aunt's kitchen and knew it would be perfect for exploring Graylock Hall. Inside, he'd stashed a small flashlight for the shadows, one of his sister's bobby pins for picking locks, a bottle of water, some plastic sandwich bags for collecting evidence, his digital camera, and a notebook and pen. The night before, Wesley had told him the legend of Nurse Janet. Even after hearing the dire warning to keep out of Graylock or else that concluded the tale, Neil wanted nothing more than to get inside the asylum in the woods to see for himself what the fuss was about. When it came to ghosts, spirits, and spooky things, Neil considered himself an expert. He and his friends back in New Jersey knew how to create a Ouija board with poster board and a Sharpie marker, how to capture a spirit on film, how to recognize the prickly feeling you get in supposedly haunted places. These all took practice to master, but Neil had some good mentors. His favorite show, Ghostly Investigators, was on every Friday night. Neil had not missed an episode since the show had debuted 2 years ago. The hosts, Alexi and Mark, had 3 great tips for optimizing data collection during a ghost hunt. Keep your batteries fresh, your mind open, and your underwear clean. Waiting for the bus home? Neil turned to find his older sister, Bree, standing behind him in the doorway. "Ha ha," said Neil, swiveling away from her. "So funny you are." "I don't think it's coming," said Bree, continuing the joke. She stepped out onto the porch, pretending to gaze down the quiet street. A strong breeze shook the leaves in the woods across the road, as if a phantom vehicle were passing by on its way to an unfathomable destination. After a moment, Bree sat down next to him. "Seriously, though, why do you look like you're going somewhere? Aunt Claire and Aunt Anna told us to wait here for them." Aunt Claire mentioned that they'd be right back. Neither of them said a thing about waiting for them. Her sister pursed her lips. "They're picking up groceries to cook us dinner tonight. The waiting was implied. I don't want you to get on their bad side after only 2 days up here." "I've got plans," said Neil softly. "The more time I spend around the aunts, the more I think about Mom." He kept the thought to himself. "Plans?" Bree squinted at him as if to scold him. "Oh, well, you've got plans. Sorry." Frustrated, Neil was about to shout out the truth. "I need to think about something else," when she gently touched his arm. "You're not the only one having a hard time with all of this. Come on." Bree tilted her head at the door behind her. "Let's watch TV." "I'm not having a hard time with anything," Neil lied. "I just don't feel like moping around when we have a whole new town to explore." "You're skipping out on the ants to explore Headston?" Bree's tone conjured a picture in his mind of the run-down main street he'd first encountered a couple days ago. The polluted river smelled a bit like old coffee. A short, yellow waterfall poured over a concrete divider near the small bridge at the town's edge. Rusted train tracks, the wooden ties of which were well on their way to a state of rot, crossed through what had once been a thriving business district, and grass had grown so high between the disintegrating planks that when the wind rustled the tall stalks, it almost sounded like a whistle. The sidewalks of Headston were cracked and crumbling. Step on a crack. It was a wonder that up here everyone's mother didn't have a broken back. Aunt Claire's pie shop is the only thing this place is going for it, Bree continued, resigned. What else do you and Wesley think you're going to find out there? We're not going into town. Bree flinched. Then, where are you going? Neil hesitated. The insane asylum? Graylock Hall? It's a psychiatric hospital, Bree said. I don't think people call them asylums anymore except in horror movies. Wesley says it's haunted. We're going looking for ghosts. No way! What do you mean, no way? Neil fumed. Give me a break, Neil. In what world do you think it's okay for you to break into an abandoned building? Who knows what toxic stuff is floating around? Never mind what might be hiding in there, or who. Neil cringed. He should have just lied. Why does lying always get such a bad rap? The thought of an empty building in the woods had been his only incentive to get out of bed that morning. Since Wesley had told him about the hospital the night before, he'd been ecstatic to have a real reason to be here in Headston. It was something to do, somewhere to go, to escape the idea of his parents. Back in New Jersey, his mother was lost in a swarm of anxious thought, trouble that had been sparked by his father's departure earlier that year to pursue a long-dreamed of acting career in California. Neil's parents had created their own hideaways, both real and imagined, and now Neil would too. Like parent, like child. He hoped the mystery of Nurse Janet would be his escape from all this. Thank goodness for non-existent cell service near the mountains, or else Bree might actually have a chance of stopping him. The ants were virtually unreachable at the grocery store. Still, they could turn into the driveway at any moment. Since you're so worried about me, why don't you come too? Neil said, forcing himself to smile, shrugging his shoulders, chuckling a bit. When his sister raised an eyebrow, he realized he laid it on way too thick. Nice try. Bree grabbed his arm. Come on, inside. Neil began to pull away when a sputtering noise came up from the driveway. Thin rubber tires kicked up gravel. A boy on a bicycle skidded to a stop. Wesley Baptist. Hey, Neil, you ready? Someone else turned off the street and rode swiftly up the path. He stopped beside Wesley and lifted off his helmet. Neil realized instantly who the boy was. Wesley had mentioned an older brother, but had said nothing about him coming with them. This is Eric! Eric was like a stressed-out version of his little brother, his face longer, his jawbone more angular, his shoulders wider. His eyes and skin were slightly darker than his little brother's, but it was obvious that the two boys came from the same parents. Straddling his bike, Eric waved a curt salute. His band kicked him out this morning, said Wesley, so he decided to tag along. He plays guitar. Eric's smile dropped away, and he threw a death glare at his little brother. They didn't kick me out, he said almost to himself. I quit. They're a terrible band. Bree stood, moving in a single fluid motion, like a dancer lifting delicately off a stage. Neil watched as she smoothed her long brown hair and straightened the hem of her baby blue t-shirt. I play the viola, she said. As the words escaped her mouth, she blushed. Eric simply stared at her. So, I know how hard it can be to work with other musicians. An orchestra, in my case, which is slightly different, but still... She cleared her throat. Maybe I should come with you guys too, she said, glancing at Neil. I mean, it's probably a good idea to have some adults there, for safety's sake. Neil pressed his lips together. He hated when she made him feel like a kid, even though she was a mere 4 years older than him. I just need to grab my sneakers. Wait for me? She dashed back into the house, not listening for an answer, slamming the screen door behind her. Who's an adult? Wesley said to Neil. I thought you said Bree was only 16. Give the girl a break, Eric said softly. She's looking for an advancer, just like you guys. Neil raised an eyebrow as Wesley smiled at him. Chapter 2. The Baptist brothers leaned their bikes against the side of the porch. Since Bree didn't have a bike of her own and was scared to ride on any of their handlebars, they'd all have to walk. Neil was annoyed, but at least Bree had given up her goal of keeping him from going to Graylock. Taking a right at the end of the driveway, the small group hiked along the side of the road. The summer sunlight filtered between the tree trunks, making stripes of shadow at their feet. Cicada song rose and fell in nearly deafening waves. The beauty of the afternoon clashed with the group's intention, a fact that was not lost on Neil, who grew increasingly excited with every step. He could almost feel the presence of the building in the woods waiting for him. "How much further?" he asked. "There's a turnoff just ahead," said Eric. "I can't believe how close your aunts live to this place." "I can't believe Neil hadn't heard of Graylock until I told him about it last night," said Wesley. "Me neither," said Bree, skipping forward so she could walk beside Eric. "I mean, I've known about it for years." After a moment of uncomfortable silence, she added, "How did you all meet?" "Well, Wesley's my little brother," said Eric with a smirk. "We go way back." Bree blushed. "Yeah, I got that, but where did you find Neil, Wesley?" "The library, of course," said Wesley. A couple days before, when Neil and Bree had arrived at their aunt's house, the first thing they all did together was visit the pie shop. After eating an amazingly gooey piece of souffle pie in the shop's cozy cafe, Neil thanked Claire and Anna and asked if he could stroll down Tully Avenue, the main road running through Hedston. He hadn't been able to get his mother's tear-stained face out of his head. "I just need some time alone, honey," she'd informed him only a week earlier. Her sister Claire had offered to take Neil and Bree for the summer. Hedston was several hours north of their home in New Jersey. Neil's uncle, Felix, lived closer in a studio apartment in Jersey City, but he also worked late in New York City. They would have been alone all day and most evenings, and at night they'd have to cramp onto a small fold-out couch. So instead, Neil had escaped up to the country with his sister, only to find unlimited time to think about all the horrible things his brain insisted he remember. Neil now understood. You cannot escape from yourself. He also understood that his brain wasn't so different from his mother's. That first day in Hedston, Neil walked up and down Tully Avenue several times, kicking stones out of his way, plucking leaves off shrubs in front of sabby-looking cottages, humming nonsense songs to himself. Neil had passed the library twice before he noticed a boy sitting on the top step, staring intensely off into the distance. Neil noticed and turned toward where the boy was gazing, but all he could see was a dip in the road that revealed a wooded hillside, the leaves of the far trees blowing in the breeze. "Do you see him?" the boy asked from the top of the stairs. After a few seconds, Neil realized that the boy was talking to him. "See who?" "The Green Man," said the boy with a smile. He wore a white t-shirt with what looked like a neon purple popsicle stain dribbled down the front. His frizzy black hair lay half-curled like a mop on top of his head. Neil looked back across the street, trying to find someone who might fit the description of Green Man. But there were only trees, hills, sky, clouds. "Don't tell me you've never heard of a Green Man," said the boy, waving for Neil to come up the stairs. "You can probably see him better from here," Neil followed, sitting next to the boy on the top step. "Green men are from Irish folklore. They're kind of a forest spirit." "Forest spirit?" Neil asked. "Is that like a ghost?" "Not really," said the boy. "More like an entity." An entity? Neil found himself amused and disturbed at the same time. The boy sounded a little crazy. "Want me to teach you to see him?" "Okay," Neil said, remembering Alexei and Mark, trying to stay open-minded. "It's mostly a mental thing," said the boy. "First, you've got to relax. Look off at the hillside. Let your vision go fuddy." Across the small valley was a blur of green. Trees, trees, more trees. "Now," the boy continued, "let the lights and the darks of the leaves leap out." Leap out? Just try. A few seconds later, something strange occurred. Neil didn't know how it happened, but just the act of staring, concentrating, put him in a different kind of place. He could feel the cold stone steps beneath him, the breeze tickling his face, but he felt elsewhere. The shadow and the light will blur. Look closer. Fall into it. He's right there in the blur. Look, a face. The boy was right. Where the shadows retreated into the mass of leaves on the hill, suddenly Neil noticed a pair of eyes blinking, a mouth opening and closing, as if reciting some silent song as the wind blew through the trees. Neil gasped, and then the face was gone. He turned to the boy. Was that thing real, the green man? The boy laughed. You saw him, didn't you? He quieted and then peered off into the distance again. You'd be surprised how easily you can find them. Sit and stare at anything for a while. It will eventually stare back. Neil chuckled, pleased to meet someone who might be as weird as himself. He'd definitely seen the face in the trees. If this boy saw it too, then they were in it together, and neither of them were nuts. The boy smiled to himself, as if the green man across the way had suddenly winked at him. I'm Wesley, by the way. Neil knew right then that they'd be friends. By the time Neil had made it back to the pie shop, he found himself looking around at pieces of the town, sidewalk stains, patterns in brickwork, shadows falling across concrete, trying to find hidden life inside all of it. He couldn't help but also think of his parents, how a useful skill such as Wesley's might have given him a clue to the secrets they had kept for so long, secrets to which he still had no satisfying answer. Here we are, said Eric, pausing near a gravel road that led into a dense growth of pine. Next to the inconspicuous intersection, hidden by tall weeds and low-hanging branches, a small wooden sign stood atop a thick post. Graylock Hall, State Hospital. Notice how it says nothing about crazy people, said Eric with a smirk. Totally bland. What would you like it to say? Wesley asked. Welcome to the loony bin? Where is it? Neil asked. Way back through the trees, said Eric. You have to cross a bridge at the end of the long driveway. The main building is on a small island in Graylock Lake. The woods are state property. There's not much else out there. As the group stood at the edge of the path, a gust of wind released needles from high pine boughs swaying over their heads. The needles scattered at their feet. The dark scent of sticky sap hung in the air. You sure you want to do this? Is it dangerous? Bree asked. Probably, Eric answered with a slight shrug. Bree sighed and hugged her ribs, as if protecting herself from a chill that didn't exist, but eventually she took the first step onto the gravel road. They all walked in silence for a while. A couple driveways turned off the thin stretch. Through the dense trees, Neil could see buildings in the distance. Old houses. He wondered if anyone still lived in them. You don't really believe the hospital has ghosts in it, Bree said eventually. Do you? She spoke directly to Eric. It was obvious to her how Neil and Wesley felt. It's hard not to believe it when so many people claim to have seen her, said Eric. Seen who? Bree whispered. The nurse. Neil would have laughed if Wesley hadn't already given him the rundown the day before. Now he listened as Eric recounted it for his sister. Though hearing it for the second time, the story again gave him chills. And we're going here, why? Said Bree, stopping in the middle of the gravel road as Eric finished the tale. There's so much to see, said Eric. After Graylock was closed 15 years ago, the patients were either moved to other institutions or released. It happened in a hurry. They even left behind charts, specimens, medical records. Wesley skipped forward. Tell them about the padded cells with gouge marks in the walls, or the bloodstains streaking the hallway floors, or the crayon graffiti drawings that decorate the spiral stairwells. Neil could tell that Bree was truly frightened. She'd locked her knees and shoved her hands deep into her pockets. If they weren't careful, she might take off in the opposite direction. That would be a disaster, especially if she had the ants drive out here to pick them up. He's kidding, said Neil, rolling his eyes. Come on, said Eric. He reached out and took her hand. I might get scared without you. Bree's knees loosened. Something sparked in her eyes, and Neil knew they were in the clear. They walked ahead. Seconds later, Wesley whispered into Neil's ear, But I wasn't kidding. Chapter 3. As the group approached the small bridge, they came to an old metal fence that leaned forward, sagging and rusted. Neil noticed a small space at the bottom. Eric grabbed the chain link and pulled up. The gap opened wider. One by one, Bree, Wesley, and Neil crawled through. Eric followed carefully, pressing himself into the dirty ground so the twists of metal wouldn't scratch. The path continued across the small concrete bridge, over the algae-coated water where tall reeds wavered, and onto the long, narrow island. Neil marveled at the sight of the hospital grounds. Pine trees lined the road, providing the ever-present shade that Neil somehow had expected to find here. Ahead, visible between the tree trunks, stood a mass of gray stone. A gate, a wall. Neil couldn't tell exactly what he was looking at. Whatever it was covered with a moss so green it appeared poisonous. There she is, said Eric. Graylock Hall. They walked in silence. The road led to a circular turnaround in front of the building. On the other side of the circle was the hospital's main entrance, a wide stone staircase that rose toward a recessed entry. Within the shadows of the portal, impenetrable black iron doors were chained shut. The building was not wide, but each of its 3 stories seemed to rise taller than the last, so that the place loomed as if it were actually leaning toward them, trying to hypnotize them forward. A small walking path circumnavigated the hospital. Opposite this trail, the land sloped quickly toward the water. It wasn't difficult for Neil to imagine a patient wandering out into the night and tumbling into the lake. Further from the shore, unimpeded by the shade of the pines, lily pads floated in the sunlight. For a patient who couldn't swim, who was confused or frightened in the first place, Neil imagined that it would have been difficult to escape the tangle of plant stalks and weeds out there. Taking in the vista, Neil was overwhelmed with a sudden sadness. People had died here. And for the people who had lived, life certainly hasn't been easy. Neither inside nor outside of these walls. He had come here hoping to escape from his tangled thoughts, but found himself twisted in new ones. Neil blinked and pulled out the digital camera, fitting its strap snugly around his wrist. He remembered how Alexia and Mark worked. They always managed to keep a critical perspective and maintain an emotional distance. They never jumped to conclusions. Neil took several pictures to make himself feel better. This was his very own ghostly investigation, a wonderful distraction. I think there's a window around the side that we can crawl through, said Eric. That's what my friend Jamie told me this morning anyway. He's been here before, but I couldn't convince him to come again. Go figure. Is Jamie in your band? Bree asked, following Eric to the left of the hospital's main entrance. Nah, I'm not really talking to those guys in the moment. The two walked on. Neil and Wesley hung back. Are you sure you're ready for this? Wesley asked. Some people think Nurse Janet is totally real. Yeah, but ghosts can't hurt you, said Neil. Where'd you get that idea? Neil thought for a few seconds. Had Alexia or Mark ever actually said that? I'm not sure. It makes sense, though. Ghosts don't have bodies, so how would they be able to touch you? Wesley said nothing. Neil worried Wesley didn't believe him. The Nurse Janet story is creepy, but I doubt her ghost would really be able to drag anyone down to the lake, even if she was totally psycho. There are other ways to hurt people, Like how? Wesley pointed to his temple right next to his small brown ear. What if they could get in here somehow? In your head? Asked Neil. He thought of his mother, of her crying fits, of her silences, her unrecognizing face. He ruminated upon that shadow person he imagined lurking inside himself, and his stomach clenched. Maybe it had been a mistake to come here. A voice called out from around the stone wall. Are you guys coming or what? It was Eric. Yes, Neil answered. Moving forward will keep the memory of his parents in the back of his mind instead of front and center. Neil and Wesley found Bree helping Eric into what looked like a tall basement window that met a slight depression in the ground. The glass had been smashed in. The grass at the base of the wall came up to Bree's knees. She held Eric's hands as he lowered himself inside. When Bree realized that the two boys were standing behind her, she blushed, looking like an accomplice to a crime. And it is a crime, thought Neil, isn't it? There's a table down here, Eric called from the darkness beyond the window. Looks pretty sturdy. The sound of wooden legs scraping against a gritty floor echoed out of the building. Then Eric's face appeared inside, at the bottom of the frame. Here! He waved. You could just climb in now. The drop isn't far. Bree breathed deeply, then sat down and scooted herself forward. From inside, Eric reached out and helped her. Wesley followed. Neil glanced around, making sure no one was watching them before he too crouched in the tall grass. He sat on the ledge of the window, and for the first time, he caught a glimpse of the hospitals inside. Dusty light revealed a wide wooden floor, a tall ceiling. Bolted high on opposite walls, were those basketball hoops? Had they found a gymnasium? Weird and kind of cool. Neil lowered his bag inside. Below, his sister held it for him. Then he dropped to the table. The safety of the sunlight remained outside. Inside, the world had turned to shadows and dust. Chapter 4. A thick layer of dirt caked the floor. Shards of glass glimmered in the dim light at the group's feet. A slimy green stripe of mildew and moss clung to the wall, dripping down from the makeshift entry. A shadowy horizontal line, about 5 feet high, stretched around the room, reminding Neil of a grimy bathtub ring. Nature was slowly reclaiming the building. The once glossy flooring was warped from water damage. Rain had repeatedly flooded the room during years of neglect. Paint peeled from the ceiling, bubbled and hanging in long strips like streamers at a party. Great chunks of plaster had fallen indiscriminately around the room, littering the court with even more debris. Playing a ballgame here today would involve a strange obstacle course, Neil thought. What penalties would you acquire for tripping over a raised board? Bree tapped Neil's shoulder and held out his bag. She stared at him silently. You okay? He asked her, reaching inside the satchel and removing his camera again. He realized that he actually appreciated that she'd come along, even if it was simply because Eric, a cute boy, had shown up. Where to? She asked, glancing around the ruined room. Neil wants his evidence, said Wesley. If Nurse Shannon haunts the youth ward, we should try to find her there. Neil raised his camera and snapped a few shots of the gymnasium. Then he waited for the other three to line up. Smile, he said as the flash lit up the room. They wandered. The labyrinthine hallways were dark, some of them almost pitch black. Neil's flashlight came in handy as they stumbled through doorways, past overturned gurneys and dust-encrusted wheelchairs, and up a narrow flight of stairs. Spiders and insects scurried away from the sudden glare. Neil kept his body tight, his limbs close to his torso, in case something reached out to grab him. The group had no idea where they were headed. Neil took comfort in snapping pictures along the way. Alexi and Mark always said, "You never know what the camera might pick up." "Where are the padded rooms?" asked Wesley. "And blood. I don't see streaks anywhere." "Yeah," said Bree. "What about graffiti in the stairwells? I thought this place was going to be much creepier. It just seems dirty." Neil held his tongue. From the ways he was scooting ahead to be close to Eric, he knew she was nervous. "And if I wanted to be scared of dirt, I'd just look under Neil's bed back in New Jersey. I swear he's got some hostile dust bunnies." Now she'd gone too far. "Such a comedian," said Neil. "Maybe he has to tell them what I found under your bed last month." "Don't you dare!" "I don't believe every story I hear," said Eric smoothly, keeping his voice low. "About this place especially. Maybe there are no padded rooms, no bloody hallway streaks, but we haven't even seen a tenth of what this place has to offer yet." Neil took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "Look!" said Wesley, pointing at a sign that was posted on a nearby wall. Activity rooms to the left, adult ward to the right, cafeteria to the right, exercise yard to the left, and youth ward to the left. "Sweet," Eric said. "Maybe the cafeteria is serving snacks. I could totally go for some nachos right now." Bree chuckled. Wesley grabbed his brother's sleeve and tugged him in the opposite direction. "Come on, Eric! You're going to drive Neil crazy!" As they headed toward the youth ward, that word hung in the air, collecting dust. Crazy. Neil took the lead, trying to outrun it. Worn linoleum covered the floors, and cracked white ceramic lined the walls. The hallways in this section of the building were long and straight. The group's footfalls echoed, ringing in their ears, as every step brought them further away from their entry point and closer toward what they hoped was their goal. They walked without speaking, as if out of respect for the former occupants, or out of plain old fear, maybe a little of both. Neil marked down each turn in his notebook so that they would have a clue about how to get back out. He understood quite well how clues worked. His mother, Linda, had been fine until January, when his father had announced he was moving out. Marriages ended all the time, Neil understood, but usually there was some big sign that something was wrong. Fights mostly, at least according to those of his friends whose parents had split up. But Neil's clues had come during the strange silences at dinners, or nights when he listened to his mom cry herself to sleep. Neil closed his notebook. Eventually, the group came to a double door. Through panes of glass that were embedded with crisscrossed wire, they saw the doors led to a large rectangular room. Sunlight spilled in from tall windows along the opposite wall. Eric pulled on the door handle. A sweet, almost nauseating scent escaped. Wesley sneezed. After they'd all slipped inside, Bree gasped. On the far left side of the room, a table had been set up as if for some sort of party. A festive cloth, faded blue with white-faced, grinning clowns, covered the table. Someone had arranged paper plates for a large gathering that seemed to never have occurred. A cake, which looked as though it had solidified underneath its faded pink sugar coating, perched in the center on a small silver stand. A large chunk of it was missing. Several conical party hats littered the floor, and a banner had half fallen from its place on the wall beyond. It read, "Happy Birthday." "Weird," Bree whispered, entranced. She bent to pick up one of the hats from the floor, but stopped herself, as if she needed to protect the site in the same way an archaeologist would. "Still hungry?" Neil said as Eric stepped forward. "It's not nachos, but petrified cake might be yummy too." Eric ignored him, turning slowly in a circle, taking in the room, mesmerized by what they'd found. The youth ward. Toys lay scattered on the floor. The glass eyes of a wooden rocking horse stared out at nothing in particular, waiting blithely for its next rider. An incomplete jigsaw puzzle sat on the floor, a few feet from the windows, its image bleached nearly white by the southern sunlight that had moved slowly across the room every day for the past 15 or so years. To the right of the windows, a shelving unit was packed with a large variety of dolls and stuffed animals, some of which had inexplicably toppled to the ground, lying like corpses at a murder scene. The rest of the creatures seemed to wait, as if their dormant lives could be reactivated by someone picking them up and offering to play. When Neil raised his camera and flashed another picture, his fellow explorers all exclaimed their version of a yelp. "Sorry," Neil whispered. "It seems like everyone left in such a hurry," said Bree. "Maybe once the staff knew they were being forced out," Eric suggested, "they realized that packing up or even cleaning would be pointless." "Still," said Bree, unable to comprehend what had gone on here during the institution's final days. Neil understood what she was feeling. It was as though they had stumbled upon a car crash, its victims long gone. This must be what Alexi and Mark experienced in places like this. He lowered his camera and simply observed the stillness, listening to the silence. Outside, a duck settled noisily upon the lake, quacking, splashing the water surface with frantic wings. "What's upstairs, I wonder?" said Wesley. He noticed what looked like a large cage in the far corner of the room, next to the party table. Inside white mess bars, a set of metal steps stretched up into the ceiling. "Or downstairs," said Neil. Underneath the up staircase, blocked by another wire door, more steps disappeared into the floor. "Look," said Eric, pointing at a sign on the wall. "Dormitory up, boiler and exit down." "That's where they slept," said Wesley. "Wouldn't hurt to check it out," said Bree, and suddenly Neil wished he hadn't made that assumption. The darkness, both upstairs and down, seemed to hum in him tunelessly. "The cage door looks locked," said Eric as Wesley reached out to grab at the grating. But the door squeaked open. Wesley raised an eyebrow and Eric shrugged. Neil grappled with his flashlight and flicked it back on. Beyond the lip of the highest stair, another hallway stretched off into inky darkness. "Guess I'm first," he said unsurely as he moved away from the comforting sunshine of the common room. Once he'd made it to the top, he turned around to make sure his friends had followed. Their wide eyes reflected his own nervousness. The hallway up here unsettled him more than any other area they'd already wandered through. Maybe it was that multiple doors stood in opposite walls every few feet, closed and blocking out whatever light they might otherwise have let in. Maybe it was the curve of the hallway at the end of the corridor that appeared to lead off into nothingness. Maybe it was the intimacy of knowing that this was where the patients had slept, lived, dreamed. Patients who had not been much older than Neil. He wondered what they had done to end up here. What had been wrong with them? When his father had left, something shifted inside Linda, as if she'd become possessed by the spirit of someone else. This new mom frightened Neil. He didn't know her at all. She cried, she screamed, she was silent for hours at a time. New mom's emergence made him wonder if he had a shadow person hiding inside him too. He certainly felt like it sometimes, especially when he thought of his parents. What would happen if the shadow decided to come out? Would that mean he was crazy? Would they send him away to a place like Graylock Hall? "When you come back, I'll be better," she told Neil finally. "I promise. I've got a lot of work to do." Neil understood it wasn't the kind of work you got paid for. You paid for it. The others stepped forward, crossing Neil and his flashlight. Eric opened the closest door. Sunlight flooded the immediate hallway. He noticed a placard on the wall. This was room number 1. Inside, dust motes swirled above a small twin bed, where a rumpled and stained pillow sat propped against a greenish-brown wall. The room itself was not much bigger than the bed itself, and the space was otherwise empty. Were they all the same, Neil wondered? He couldn't imagine spending 10 minutes alone in this room, never mind a night or a week, a month, a year. More. Guys, he whispered, maybe we shouldn't. But the group had separated, opening different doors as they moved down the hallway. Neil gave in and comforted himself by taking pictures as he drifted from room to room. The walls in one had been decorated with posters, mostly of cute baby animals with not quite witty slogans printed underneath the images. One poster instructed a kitten who was dangling precariously from a tree branch to hang in there, baby. When Neil peeked his head back outside in the hallway, he realized he was alone. In the hallway behind him, where he and his friends had opened the doors, light filled the space. But that far bend in the corridor ahead remained as shadowed as before. If everyone had gone out without him, why had none of them opened the doors like they'd done before? A quiet shuffling sound came from the darkness. Neil's flashlight provided a tiny bit of comfort as he made his way around the bend. His light revealed another long passage that extended further than the beam. A door about halfway down the new hall was open. However, no sunlight streamed forth. If the room had a window, something was blocking it. A curtain, a board. He crept closer. Hello? His voice sounded louder than he'd meant it to. No one answered. That shuffling sound continued. Soft soles on a slick floor. Neil paused, his skin prickling. Hello? He whispered this time again. No answer. He tried to take another step forward, but he found he couldn't move. His muscles felt like jello, his shoes like cement bricks. Still holding the flashlight in place, he raised his camera to adjust the settings, preparing to snatch a hurried shot in case something unpleasant suddenly appeared before him. Neil forced his feet forward, dragging his sneakers against the tile, the rubber soles squealing their opposition. He came to the edge of the doorframe. The placard on this open door read 13, lucky number 13. Leaning forward with the flashlight, Neil appeared around the corner. A white figure stood in the center of the small bedroom. She seemed to be staring at the shuttered window. Her long brown hair hung almost halfway down her back. She clenched her fists at her sides, but she did not turn, not even when Neil let out a small groan. He'd found Nurse Janet. Chapter 5. The figure swayed slightly, and Neil immediately realized his mistake. She was not dressed in white, but the bright flashlight had made it seem so. Bree was wearing the same blue t-shirt and shorts as when they left the aunt's house. That was how he'd recognized her. Still, something was strange here. Hadn't she heard him calling? Bree, Neil said quietly, calmly. She made no sign that she'd heard him. Bree, he said, louder this time. Again, nothing. This was weird. Too much like his mom. Neil had worried about his own shadow person. Should he have been worrying about Bree, too? Neil stepped through the doorway. Even though the room was about the same size as the other ones, this one felt smaller, claustrophobic, as if the walls were moving in on him. He touched Bree's shoulder, but she did not turn. Instead, she simply said, "There's something about this room." Her voice sounded foggy, as if she'd just woken from a deep sleep. Let's go. Neil's flashlight flickered. A flash of panic crackled his skin. Shadows leaped out from the walls momentarily before retreating swiftly back into place. Bree finally turned to look at him, but her eyes were blank, as if she were peering through him. Several seconds passed before she blinked and appeared to recognize him. "Come on," Neil tried again. "We've got to find Wesley and Eric." "Who?" Neil clutched the flashlight even harder and noticed his hand shaking. He answered slowly, carefully. "We came here with my friend Wesley Baptist and his brother Eric. Remember?" Under different circumstances he'd have poked his chest, thinking he was teasing, but now she merely nodded, thankful for the reminder. Neil reached out to take her hand, but she stepped backwards, toward the blackened window. "This room," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "What about it?" Neil said, frustrated as he moved toward the doorway. At that moment, he only wanted to get back down to the common room. "Shh!" Bree cocked her head, listening to what sounded like silence. "Do you hear that?" A chill wrapped Neil's body, head to toe. "Hear what?" "Whispering." The flashlight winked out. Darkness came like eyes shut tight. Neil and Bree collided with each other before bouncing away. They both screamed, then froze, paralyzed by fear and a dizzying sense of disorientation. "We're fine," Neil said a second later. "The battery died." He flicked the flashlight switch on and off, trying without success to milk the last of the juice from it. They were blind. After shoving the device into his bag, he managed to find Bree's hand in the darkness. "Come on!" Wham! The room shook. Neil felt himself fall backwards, tripping and landing on a damp mattress. Bree's voice lifted dramatically. "What was that?" "I don't know," he said, standing. "Let's go." He dashed toward the doorway, only to meet a blossom of pain. His forehead and his nose felt as if they'd exploded. He groaned. Something wet dripped over his lip. He stuck out his tongue and tasted blood. "The door must have slammed shut," said Bree, a disembodied voice beside him. Back to normal. "Are you okay? That sounded bad." He wiped at his face, the warm liquid coating the back of his hand. "I'm bleeding." "Your nose?" "Yep." "Pinch it, up near the bridge." Bree touched his shoulder. Neil heard her fidgeting with the doorknob. "This thing is stuck." Neil's entire face throbbed, but this news made the rest of his body feel numb. "Can you help?" Bree asked. Ignoring the pain, Neil reached out blindly. He grabbed the knob, but it wouldn't turn. Even when he threw his weight backward, the door refused to give. "Are we trapped in here?" "Wesley!" Bree cried. "Eric, we know you're out there." She listened to the silence for several seconds. "This is not funny. Let us out." She pounded on the metal door. It reminded him of thunder. They could use some lightning. The camera, it had a flash. Maybe there was a latch on the door that they'd missed. He grabbed at the camera, which still hung from his wrist, but lost precious seconds as it slid from his grip, his fingers trembling and slick with his own blood. Finally, he clutched the camera's metal casing and held the device out before him. "Stand back," he said. He pressed the shutter button, and cold light burst inside the small room. When the after-image of the flash died down, the room seemed darker still. Even if he had seen the details of the doorknob, he wouldn't have been able to figure it out now. "Useless," he whispered. "Not useless," said Bree. "Turn on the view screen. It's got to give off a bit of light." Licking his lip, tasting the coppery liquid there, Neil blindly pressed a couple buttons. The screen on the back of the camera glowed blue. He held it up to the doorknob. It appeared plain, round, silver. If there was a lock at all, it was on the outside. What the heck? How are we supposed to? Someone sussed him. But it wasn't Bree. Wide-eyed, he and his sister stared at each other, their faces lit by the camera from below. Slowly they turned. At the other side of the room, near the window, a dark shape stood completely still. It looked like one of their own shadows. Neil knew this wasn't possible. The camera's light was between them and the shape. Their shadows should have cast on the door behind them. Shaking, unable to speak, Neil held up the camera, trying to see who was there. The figure shifted forward. In the dim light, Neil made out some faint details. Long dark hair, clothed in a light dress, possibly a uniform. Neil tried to scream, but he couldn't. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't blink. Even his bloody nose felt as if it had stopped flowing. Then, just like the flashlight, the camera died. Chapter 6. Something shoved Neil and Bree forward. The floor tilted. The darkness spiraled. They were falling, spinning. But no. The door had merely opened with a swift jolt, knocking into them, sending them off balance. Neil took a step and caught himself. "What are you guys doing in here?" Wesley's voice came from the hallway. A sliver of dim light broke the curtain of shadow. Without thinking, Neil yanked the door the rest of the way open. He grabbed his sister's arm, and together they leaped out of the room. "Run!" he called to Wesley, who stood momentarily stunned behind them before springing forward. The trio sprinted toward the bend in the corridor, where daylight greeted them like a parent waiting with open arms. They raced toward the stairs. Neil did not look back. Memories of the Nurse Janice story flickered through his head, like old film from a loud projector, and all he could think of now was her strong hand reaching for his collar. At any moment he would be caught, choked. As his lower body continued to race forward, his feet would flip upward. He'd fall flat on his back, looking at the ceiling as her pale face came closer and closer, glaring down at him as she... "Watch out!" Bree grabbed Neil's arm just as he was about to topple headfirst off the top stair. He swung out and clasped the railing, pinning himself against the wall. Rattled as he was, Neil managed to peer back into the darkness at the corridor's bend. His heart galloped, his lungs burned. His eyes scanned the distance for any movement, anything at all. But nothing was there, nothing he could see anyway. "Can we not stop here, please?" he said. "Are you okay?" said Wesley, following Neil and Bree briskly down the stairs. "You're bleeding, Neil." "I ran to the door back in that room." "I heard you guys shouting. Did you see something?" At the bottom of the stairs, Neil finally found his breath. The sunlight had sunk to a position where it hit the lake and reflected golden light all around the common room. "I don't know what we saw," Bree said. "Where's your brother?" "I'm here." Eric came through a doorway on the other side of the cake table. He was holding what looked like a brown file folder. "I found an office. You would not believe the things they left behind in this place." When he saw the state of the trio, his eyes grew wide. "What happened?" "Don't ask," said Neil. "We're leaving." "Really?" said Eric. "But it looks like things are starting to get good." "You been down here for a while?" Bree asked with a scowl. Eric nodded slowly, wearing an almost obnoxious expression that said, "What's your problem?" "Someone is upstairs," said Bree. "In one of the bedrooms. She tried to lock me and Neil inside." "Nurse Janet?" said Wesley unsurely. "No way," said Eric, starting past them toward the staircase. Wesley grabbed his arm. Eric flung him away. "I want to check it out for myself." He paused and then added, I can't wait to tell the band about this. They kicked you out, Wesley shouted. You don't know what you're talking about. Eric yanked the mess door open and climbed the steps 2 at a time. He disappeared into the opening at the ceiling. Bree shook his head. Forget him. I'm not spending another minute in this place. Wesley blinked. We can't leave him up there. Why not? Said Bree. He's happy to leave us down here. Her cheeks flushed red. Neil could see that all the charms he collected from Eric earlier had evaporated. No one messed with Bree, Neil knew. Eric would learn. You can stay, Wesley, but I'm taking Neil with me. Neil sighed, but... Wesley held up his hand. You're right. Listening to the silence from upstairs, he added, He can't be a real jerk sometimes. He called out, Meet us outside, Eric! They didn't receive an answer. The three headed back through the door of the youth ward into the long hallway, running in the direction of the crumbling gymnasium. At least, that's where they thought they were headed. Even though Neil had marked every turn they made, after what had happened in room 13, his sense of direction was now screwed up. Not good, since they were heading into some very dark places without a working flashlight. Which way? Asked Bree in an intersection of 2 hallways that looked exactly like the last one they'd come to. Maybe there's a sign like before, said Wesley, peeking around a corner. But don't we have to go down some stairs eventually? Neil asked. In fact, through an open doorway up ahead, there was a stairwell. The group crept forward. The passage led down into complete darkness. Is this the one we came up? I think so, said Wesley. There's got to be another way out, said Bree. One that doesn't involve us wandering around a pitch-black maze. What if we just keep going straight ahead on this floor instead? We could try that, said Wesley. I mean, it's not like we're trapped in here or anything. You're right, Neil answered quickly. The memory of the blindness he's experienced upstairs swept through him. He knew he'd have nightmares tonight. Best to remain logical, level-headed, like Alexei and Mark. He stepped back from the stairwell and nodded down the corridor. Let's try this way. At the very least, if we come to a window, we can climb out. It shouldn't be too far a drop. I remember the second story being pretty high up, said Bree. And after everything else, I really don't feel like breaking my ankle today. Neil shrugged. Glancing back down the stairwell, he said, Well, there's our other option. The darkness seemed to swell near the bottom steps like black floodwater rising steadily. You're right, said Bree. There's no way... said Wesley. Listen. Then Neil heard it too. From back toward the youth ward, sharp footsteps echoed toward them. Eric, Wesley whispered. Eric's wearing sneakers, said Bree. Isn't he? It's got to be somebody else, said Neil. The legend said Nurse Janet's heavy heels could be heard throughout Graylock Hall, and judging from the sound, she was getting closer. Chapter 7. They ran, tripping, colliding with one another. The hallway expanded, seemed to grow. They didn't know where they were headed, but they didn't care, as long as it was away from the sound of the approaching footsteps. Their own footfalls now bounced off the walls. The squeaking of their rubber soles on the cracked linoleum sounded like an old-fashioned drag race, cars skidding on a wet track. For a moment, Neil imagined that was exactly what they were doing, racing. And if they lost... Ghosts can't hurt you, he thought. But Neil's bruised nose continued to throb. His lips still tasted of blood. What if Wesley hadn't been here to open that door? Would Neil and Bree have spent the night here in Graylock Hall? How long would it have taken for someone to come looking for them, and how much longer to find them in that obscure upstairs hallway? Neil sprinted, pumping his arms faster, determined to reach the door that was just ahead, to slam it shut and barricade it from whatever was chasing them. Bree and Wesley kept up. They all careened through the doorway and found themselves at what first appeared to be a dead end. Another large room, high-beamed ceilings, an expansive, scratched-up wooden floor. A wide stone mantel was set deep into the far wall. A fireplace, blackened with soot, opened like a howl beneath it. This room had once been used for entertaining. Rotting leather couches and wide circular tables were pushed against the wall in front of a wall of built-in bookcases. An enormous Persian rug had been rolled up and shoved underneath the row of windows that looked out over the lake. A loud ruckus erupted from a far corner of the room. Turning, the trio watched in horror as a massive black entity expanded, pulsating and shivering, all the way up to the ceiling. Wesley screamed. Moments later, he covered his mouth, attempting to contain his nervous laughter. It was only birds. Several large crows circled overhead, cawing, taunting them, before settling back down near the fireplace mantel. A strong breeze came in through the cracked windows, where the birds had found entry. Below the windows, beside the carpet, the floor looked as though it was sagging. Judging by the view of the pines outside, Neil imagined that the gymnasium might be directly below them now. He wiped the remaining blood from his face and stepped further into the room to get a better look. If they'd entered the hospital just outside, they could easily find their way back to the small bridge and the chain-link fence. They'd only have to wait for Eric to... Neil swayed forward as the floor dipped. He shouted. The wood gave way, and sharp splinters gouged his shin. Panic, pain. Bree and Wesley rushed forward, but he called out, "Stay back!" They obeyed. He breathed through the stabbing sensations that ran up and down his leg. The entire floor could give out. "Then you get away from there too," Bree cried. The floor began to creak. Neil imagined a wide wooden mouth opening up and swallowing him. It would be a long drop to the gymnasium floor below. Neil carefully sat and pulled his leg from the sharp edges of the small hole. As soon as he'd gotten himself out, he plucked several long splinters from the raw wound. He tried to brush away some of the dust and dirt from his skin, but already the pain had begun to magnify. His skin had split deeply in several places. It was tender, starting to swell and bead with blood. He felt hands on his shoulders. Looking up, he saw Bree. She slowly pulled him away from the weak patch of flooring. "Are you okay?" "I don't know." The room was spinning. Neil wanted to puke, but he also felt like laughing. Strange. He knew that nothing about this was funny. They made a huge mistake coming here, and the question now was, how would they get out? The birds on the mantel mocked them. "Caw, caw, caw, caw." "Oh, shut up," said Wesley, throwing the birds a nasty look. "Can you walk, Neil?" Neil struggled but managed to stand up. He groaned as the pain seemed to burst his leg into tiny pieces. "I don't know," he said, gasping. "I hope so." Bree stood on one side of him and Wesley on the other. He put his arms around their shoulders. Together, they managed to move toward the possibility of safety near the bookcases. "What now?" said Bree. "We're going to have to go back to that staircase down the hallway, aren't we?" "What if Nurse Janet is out there waiting for us?" Wesley asked. Footsteps echoed near the wall directly behind him. When they turned, one of the tall cells seemed to shake back and forth. The three were all too surprised to move, to speak. The shelves crept forward, hinged on one side. It was a hidden door. A stone passage appeared. Inside, darkness wheezed at them. But no, it was not a wheezing sound. Something walked, shoes against stone, coming toward them. Chapter 8. A human shape materialized. When it stumbled into the dimming light of the ballroom, it let out a choking sound as if it hadn't taken a breath in years. Seconds later, when their eyes adjusted and their brains caught up to their imaginations, Bree, Wesley, and Neil realized that this was no mysterious figure. This was Wesley's brother. "Eric," said Wesley, "what are you doing in there?" Eric glanced up at the group. Taking in the scene of minor carnage, the blood now dripping down Neil's leg, the hole in the middle of the floor, the crows tapping curious claws on the mantelpiece, and the looks of horror on the trio's faces, Eric shook his head in astonishment. "Jeez, I keep missing all the good stuff," he said. Bree scoffed. "Good stuff? Where have you been?" He told them. Upstairs, he'd gone further down the dark hallway, past room 13, twisting and turning through several wings of the hospital, as if in a daze, until he realized he was entirely lost. He'd ended up in an administrative office and stumbled across a dark crack in one of the stone walls. Upon examination, he discovered what appeared to be a clandestine and very dusty stairwell spiraling downward like a castle turret. At a certain point during his descent, he'd heard what sounded like familiar voices. He pushed his weight against a wooden panel and found his brother and his new friends staring at him. "We need to go," said Bree, barely able to look at him. "Now! Neil is seriously hurt." "Not seriously," Neil started, but when she threw him a sharp look, he shut his mouth. "I think this is the best way out," said Eric, pointing back toward the passage. "It might get us down to the ground level at least." "Might?" said Bree. "The gym is right below us, right, Neil?" said Wesley. "We can crawl out the window where we came in." Once outside, Neil realized that he'd been holding his breath since reaching the gymnasium floor. As they climbed, one by one, through the broken window, he almost expected a booming voice to call out, echoing through the cavernous room, telling them to stop, that they were not allowed to leave. They returned to find men directly behind them, wearing white coats and Halloween masks with wide plastic grins, carrying straitjackets and leather ankle restraints to bind them, and drag them all screaming back up to room 13, where they would finally meet Nurse Janet face to face. But that did not happen, of course. The sun had fallen behind the horizon of trees across the small body of water. It was getting late. The ants were most certainly waiting for them, worrying. They made their way back toward the small bridge. When Neil had to kneel down and crawl under the gap in the fence, he cried out. The gases on his legs seemed to open up and wail at him. Wesley pushed him forward, and Bree helped him stand up again. "You need a doctor," said Bree, shaking her head. "I'm fine," Neil insisted. Wesley shook his head. "You look like the last survivor in one of those bloody slasher movies, for real." They ventured back toward the main road. They were all covered in dirt and grime, their hair sweat slicked to their scalps. The shoulder seam in Bree's formerly cute blue t-shirt had separated, revealing a small scrape. How did this happen, Neil wondered. Neil understood the stories now, why visitors to the hospital in the woods only came out here once before deciding that it had been one trip too many. But was this a story he should tell to his friends during lunch at school? They'd think he was crazy. And if they ever found out the truth about his mother's problems, his classmates would surely start telling stories about him too. Someone stepped out of the woods in front of them, blocking their path to the main road. A tall man. His big head was shaved bald. A long gray beard grew from sunken cheeks. He looked older than the ants by many years, yet his shoulders were broad, his arms muscular. He wore a black and red plaid shirt and dirt-dusted dark jeans. The group paused. Neil was too exhausted to even react. The man crossed his arms, his brow crinkled. He looked as if he knew exactly where they had been and what they'd been up to. But before he could scold them, he seemed to digest their appearance, taking special notice of Neil's bloody leg. He sighed as if he'd seen this kind of thing before. "Graylock," said the man, his voice low and rough. This wasn't a question, and thus gave the group no option to deny the accusation. He shook his head. "When you all gonna learn? It's a dangerous place. Was before they closed it. Still is." He nodded at the woods behind them. "I've lived back there for years, and I've seen enough of this nonsense for a lifetime. Always blood, always. Come on, I'll drive you kids home." He nodded at Neil. "At the rate you're walking, you won't make it back before midnight." He turned around and headed toward the building in the distance, the roof of his house barely visible through the thick foliage. None of them moved or said a word, but Neil knew what they were thinking. Never accept a ride from strangers, a rule that had been drilled into them from infancy. The man turned back and glared at them. "What's the holdup?" "We don't know you," said Eric. "Sorry." "Well, I know you," said the man. "You're the Baptist boys. I used to work with your father at the mill." He glanced at Bree and Neil. "You must be Anna and Claire's niece and nephew. They told me you were coming up from New Jersey. I'm Andy. I stop at the Pass All Bay every morning for coffee." The group stared at him in shock. "Don't believe me? I can call them right now and tell them what you were all up to out here." "No," said Bree. "No, thank you, please. We don't want to worry them." "Probably too late for that," said Andy. "How long have you all been playing around out here?" Neil wanted to tell him that they hadn't been playing around at all. The playing around was the opposite of what they'd been doing. But neither he nor any of the others said a word. Andy smiled softly, letting them know he was merely poking fun. "Come on! My truck is right up here!" Chapter 9. Climbing into the front seat of Andy's pickup, Neil cried out in pain. It felt as if someone had replaced his shin bone with a hot iron spike. Sitting behind the wheel, Andy glanced over at Neil's injury. "Maybe I have to take you to see Dr. Simon down on Yarrow Street. Your aunts would probably want to do the same thing anyway." Bree, Wesley, and Eric had climbed into the truck bed and could not hear this exchange. Neil didn't know what to say. As much as his leg hurt, he was kind of happy that it was a distraction from the nightmare they'd encountered that afternoon. "I'll drive you by Anna and Claire's," said Andy. "If they're home, they'll take care of it. If not, we're all going to the doctor." Looking down at Neil's leg, he sucked his teeth, wincing dramatically. "Ooh, Graylock's looking bad." At the aunt's house, the driveway was empty save for the Baptist brothers' bikes that were still propped against the front porch. Andy slowed but didn't stop, zipping toward the center of Headston, and Neil cringed. Where could the aunts be? Shouldn't they have been home from the grocery store by now? He supposed he deserved to feel terrible. He had done the same thing to them after all. left the house for the asylum in the woods with absolutely no hesitation, no mention of where he was going. Hadn't Aunt Anna been watching him cautiously since he'd arrived, as if she had something to worry about? If he wasn't more careful, she might talk Aunt Claire into sending him to stay with his uncle in Jersey City, or worse, back home to his mother. He could forget about escaping from thoughts of his parents then. 5 minutes later, after Andy parked in front of the regal-looking white house, Bree hopped over the edge of the truck bed and opened Neil's door for him. "Where are we?" she whispered. Neil pointed over her shoulder. A small black sign was posted on a slightly tilted pole in the center of the White House's large lawn. It read, "Dr. Julius Simon, Family Medicine." Leading the group up the stone path to the front door, Andy said, "Dr. Simon is an old friend. It's late, but I'm sure he'll see you." Andy tried the knob, but it was locked. He rang the doorbell. A few seconds later, an annoyed-looking elderly woman answered. She wore a floor-length white cotton nightgown. Strange, thought Neil, since it was still daylight. When she noticed that Andy was the caller, her scowl softened. "Hi, Maud," he said. "We've got a bit of an emergency here." He turned around and indicated the motley tribe standing behind him. Neil couldn't help but blush. "Can we pull Julius away from Wheel of Fortune for a few minutes?" Maud smiled reluctantly. "He won't be happy, but if it's an emergency..." Andy pointed at Neil's leg. "My goodness," she said. "That looks bad." Wide-eyed, she stepped aside and held out her hand, indicating that they were free to enter. She led them down a long hall, the walls of which were covered with dark blue floral wallpaper, to a small sitting room crammed with a variety of cushy antique chairs. Most of the upholstery was stained or ripped or simply worn out. Even so, Neil took comfort in getting off his feet as soon as he could. The others sat down, too. "Be right back," Andy said, and followed Maud through another door, leaving them alone in the waiting room. "I want to call the aunts," said Bree, looking around, looking for a phone. "They weren't home when we passed by," Neil said. "Maybe they're out looking for us." "We're so dead," said Bree, plopping down in the chair next to Neil. "Yeah," said Wesley. "Our mom and dad aren't going to be too happy with us either." Eric leaned forward on the couch where he sat with his brother. From the back of his pants, he pulled the file folder he'd taken from the office in the youth ward. "You stole that?" said Bree. "So?" said Eric. "Nobody else seemed to want it." Bree sighed. The elation she may have felt at having met him seemed to have finally leaked entirely out of her. "What's in it?" Wesley asked, peeking over his brother's shoulder. "Not sure," said Eric. "Doctor's notes, medical history, stuff like that." He flipped the folder over and showed them the name that had been typed on the tab. Caroline Crown. She was 16. The doctor wrote down that she was suffering from hysteria, whatever that means. "It means they thought she was too emotional," said Bree. "Lots of women in the 1800s used to be locked up for simply speaking their minds." "Yeah," Eric said. "But this girl wasn't locked up in the 1800s. She seems to really need help." He opened the folder and shuffled through several pages. "She's attempted suicide several times. She was in Graylock for her own protection. At least, that's what it says here." "I can't imagine that being stuck there will make anyone feel less depressed," said Neil. "Not all mental hospitals are like Graylock," said Bree. "The one Mom's at is really—" "Bree!" Neil shouted. His sister covered her mouth and closed her eyes, as if she couldn't stand to be in the same room with the words she'd just spoken. "Your mom's in a mental hospital?" Eric asked, closing the folder and placing it on the coffee table. Neil glared at Bree. He refused to open her eyes. It's not a mental hospital, he said. She goes to a clinic in New Jersey, outpatient, which means she doesn't have to spend the night there or anything. She's just been upset since our dad moved to California. He sighed. It's why we're up here in Heston. Our aunts invited us to stay until she's feeling better. He didn't bother meeting their eyes. She'll be fine soon, Bree said. Everything is going to be okay. I'm sure it will be, said Eric quietly. A door across the room swung open and hit the wall. A short, thin man dressed in a white coat breezed into the space. All righty then, he said. Where's my patient? Chapter 10. In the small white room, Neil sat atop crisp paper on the exam table. So, Andy tells me he found you kids playing in the stay woods, said Dr. Simon. He said that? The doctor nodded. What he didn't tell me was how you did this to yourself. Neil felt his face burn. I fell. Not a lie, but not exactly the truth. I see. The doctor sat on a small stool with wheels. He scooted forward and examined the scrapes on Neil's shin. Then he stood and checked out Neil's nose. The doctor reached for a tissue and handed it over. Neil wiped at his nostrils. Caked blood came away, flecked on the paper. The doctor held a small light up to Neil's eyes. Well, the good news is that none of this looks too serious. We'll clean you up, bandage your leg. What's the bad news? Dr. Simon smiled. Andy said he's heading out to locate Anna and Claire. Knowing how protective those two are, I can assure you that the rest of your night will not be as fun as this. Neil's lungs tightened. Really? Are they that strict? The doctor smiled and opened a nearby cabinet, fetching a small bottle of iodine. This may sting a little. When he'd finished with Neil, Dr. Simon led the way back to the waiting room, where he rejoined Bree, Wesley, and Eric. So, I suppose you'll just stay here until your aunt show up. Can I use your phone? Wesley asked the doctor. My parents are probably wondering where we are. Dr. Simon pointed at another door opposite the one he'd come through. Bree asked Neil, Everything okay? Dr. Simon nodded his head. He's fine. Just make sure he changes the bandage tomorrow. Keep it clean. Soap, water, and a little hydrogen peroxide won't hurt. Then the doctor glanced at the brown file folder on the coffee table. He flinched. Eric noticed Dr. Simon's reaction and immediately grabbed for the folder. But it was too late. The doctor had seen it. He looked at each of them. Something in his eyes made Neil nervous. Where did you get that? Said Dr. Simon, sounding as though he already knew the answer. It's all yours, said Eric, if that's what you were wondering. Eric! Bree whispered, shocked at his rudeness. That's not what I was wondering, Ashley. Dr. Simon held out his hand. Eric pressed his lips together, and then he handed the folder to the doctor. Dr. Simon tucked his new prize underneath his arm. He stiffened, suddenly businesslike. You may wait for Anna and Claire here, but I would suggest that there are places in this town where your presence is not welcome. He glanced down at Neil's bandages. As the evidence your advances today should remind you. You're not going to tell the aunts, are you? Neil asked. Dr. Simon smiled, a surprisingly sad expression, and answered, I hope I won't have to. Chapter 11. They took Andy up on his offer to drive them home. Later, after the Baptist brothers left, Neil sat with Bree at the kitchen table, dutifully chopping broccoli florets. "I'm not going to lie," said Claire, standing at the sink, rinsing a colander filled with stringy pasta. "You had us worried sick." Neil still felt extremely guilty. He hadn't even tried to take their feelings into account when he set off for Graylock. "Next time you want to go for a walk, just leave us a note. We don't want you to think we're holding you captive here, but, well, Anna does suffer from a heart murmur. You can't cause her any trouble." Anna stood near the stove, and she leaned far out of her way to bump Claire with her hip. "Leave me and my heart out of this," she said. Her voice sounded jovial, but Neil could read skepticism in her brow. She definitely hadn't bought Andy's story that they'd been surveying the trails behind their house and Neil tripped on a log. "We're sorry," said Bree, who sat across the table from Neil, peeling carrots. "I don't know what we were thinking." She tossed him a painful look. "The woods are intriguing," said Claire matter-of-factly. "If not a little dangerous. I don't blame you for wanting to explore. We go for long walks sometimes, too." "True," said Anna. "But Claire and I managed to stick to the paths. You guys already know how easy it is to get hurt. It's even easier to get lost." She glanced over her shoulder, throwing Neil and Bree a look that said she knew exactly what they'd been up to. "Just a warning." After dinner, at Neil's request, the four sat down to watch Ghostly Investigators. The ants had never seen the show before. Tonight's episode was about an abandoned amusement park on the coast of Rhode Island. During the show, Neil described the crew who was involved, how the investigators worked, the tools they used. EMF detectors read fluctuations in electromagnetism. Its flashing lights indicated a field change and the possibility of a spirit. Digital recorders captured voices that could not be heard by human ears. Heat-sensitive cameras traced hot and cold spots, another hint that spectral visitors were nearby. The ants listened skeptically, but seemed to enjoy the episode. At the end, Alexia and Mark remarked that they'd gathered enough evidence to conclude that the park was indeed a haunted place. "Even after all that," said Anna, "I still can't quite believe. Ghosts? I'm a doubter at heart." "That's just because you've never seen one," said Claire. "Have you?" Neil asked Claire. His injured leg was propped up on the couch at his aunt's insistence. Claire bunched up her face and shrugged. "I've seen things. Nothing I can be sure of. But that's how it works, doesn't it? You get a fleeting glimpse of whatever it is you can't explain." "Yes," Anna nodded. "But the difference between us is that if I catch a glimpse of something odd, I found a reason for it. You tend to harp on until you convince yourself. Boogeyman." She chuckled and sighed. "Claire and your mother both put more faith in their imaginations than I do." At the mention of his mother, Neil flinched. Like parent, like child. "But what exactly have you seen, Aunt Claire?" Bree asked. Claire sat silently, looking like she was unsure whether or not to tell the story. Anna crossed her arms and cleared her throat. Claire ignored her and leaned forward. "Have you heard the legend of Graylock? It's the hospital that used to be back in the woods here." "Yeah," said Neil hesitantly. He avoided Bree's glare. "We've heard stories." "On our walks in the woods," Claire went on, "I sometimes get the feeling I'm being watched." "See?" said Anna, throwing up her hands. "Would you call that ghostly?" "That's not all," said Claire. She turned to Anna, her face growing stern. "I never told you this, but once, a couple years ago, when we were near that lake, I swear I saw someone standing at the water's edge, among the reeds, just standing there, looking at us." "What did the person look like?" asked Neil, trying to contain the sick giddiness that was gathering in his chest. "She was tall, long brown hair, I think, dressed in white." "Nurse Jana," Neil whispered to himself. "Who?" Anna asked. He answered, his cheeks turning pink. "I was just thinking out loud." Anna squinted at him, looking as if she never wanted him to say that name again. But the expression only lasted for a couple of seconds before softening. "Your leg all right?" she asked. "How about some more pillows?" When the aunt said goodnight, Neil brought his borrowed satchel upstairs to his room. He tossed it in a chair beside the bed, where it landed with a thunk. The dead flashlight and camera were still inside, along with the other items he'd packed that afternoon. He lay down, his legs stinging, his nose puffy. Someone knocked at his door. A moment later, Bree peered in at him. "What's up?" said Neil, even though he knew that the answer was plenty. "Just checking in on you." "I'm fine." Bree nodded slowly and entered anyway. She sat on the edge of his bed, glancing at his leg, looking as if she needed to tell him something but couldn't speak. Finally, she managed, "I was really scared today, Neil." He felt the same way, but refused to admit it. "And I'm not just talking about you getting hurt either," she continued. "There was something inside that place, something I can't explain." Neil felt his stomach clench, and though he didn't want to bring it up, there was one question he had to ask. "Why did you go into room 13? He whispered. He remembered his sister's blank expression when she turned to face him. Bree stared at the ceiling. "That's the thing. I don't know. I walked down that hallway into the dark. I noticed the door was open a crack. I felt like I had to go inside, like it had been my destination all along. And as soon as I did, I felt strange, like something was trying to talk to me, something without a mouth, without a voice. I felt like I couldn't leave until I heard what it had to say. Then you showed up, and everything went weird." Neil shivered. "That's totally not what I thought you were going to say. You've always been more like Anna. You don't believe in this stuff." Bree shrugged. "But you felt it too, didn't you?" "I don't know what I felt," said Neil. "It was so strange. We both got confused." Then, as an afterthought, he added, "And you're sure you didn't shut the door on us?" "I think I'd remember doing that." Neil wasn't satisfied, but he kept his mouth shut. Could it really have been a ghost? And if not, was the alternative even scarier? Bree looked at the satchel on the chair beside the bed. "Maybe we can track down some new batteries for the camera tomorrow. Those pictures might show us something we can't remember or didn't see." "Oh my gosh," Neil said, sitting up on his bed. Bree stepped away as if he might explode. "What's wrong?" "The flashlight, the camera. When we were in room 13, the batteries died almost instantaneously." "And?" "According to Alexi and Mark, that's a sign that something is trying to manifest." "Manifest?" "Appear, make itself known. A spirit doesn't have its own energy, so it needs to take energy from other places in order to do stuff." "Stuff like what?" "Like what happened in room 13. Despite himself, Neil smiled a bit. This was good. He and his sister might not be taking after Mom and Dad after all. "So you're saying that thing we saw was a ghost?" said Bree, crossing her arms. "And that this ghost somehow drained the batteries from the flashlight and the camera? To do what?" "Show herself to us," Neil nodded. Bree simply stood there, her chest heaving. He knew that she was freaking out, especially since he wasn't talking about freaking out. "That's an interesting theory," Bree said. Exactly, totally freaked, Neil thought. I'm tired. I'll see you in the morning. We'll replace those batteries, see what we can find." Bree closed his door, leaving Neil alone. He slipped under his covers and stared at the ceiling. He briefly wondered how his mother was doing at that moment down in New Jersey. Then he closed his eyes and tried to shake her face out of his head. Instead, he thought of the ghost, his wonderfully disturbing new distraction. Why would Nurse Janet want to show herself to him? Why had she appeared to Aunt Claire down by the water's edge? And most important, he wondered, had his camera picked up her image before she'd sucked the batteries dry? Neil turned off the lamp next to his bed. The suburban streetlights back home always seeped through his curtains, providing a calming sense of the world outside. Here, the room disappeared into the dead blackness of the countryside night. After a few seconds, his vision adjusted and he made out small details. Knobby wooden posts at the end of his bed, the outline of the tall, thin windows, his own skinny hand in front of his face. Closing his eyes again, sinking into the soft down pillow, Neil's brain buzzed to see the contents of the camera's memory. But when he imagined what, besides Nurse Janet, might be represented there, a strange sensation teased him, as if Graylock's shadows had followed him home, nipping at his heels. Just before sleep took him away, new questions arose in his mind. Would the asylum in the woods be a salvation, a new kind of hideaway from his troubles? Or was it a trap, pinning him to the darkness of his shadow self? What was it worth to learn the answer? Chapter 12. That night, Neil dreamed of the hospital. He was in the back of a van. He couldn't move. Glancing down at his body, he realized he was strapped to a wheelchair. When the vehicle abruptly stopped, someone opened the door, and someone else guided the chair down a wooden ramp to a paved road in the middle of a dense wood. He tried to turn his head, to look down, but his spine was locked down too, tied tightly to a high metallic spindle. Forced to face forward, he saw the road led straight toward a familiar island. The chain-link fence was gone. The concrete bridge was in perfect shape. Crossing the water, he noticed that the surface was clear of green scum. The healthy reeds grew with an almost cultivated appearance, trim, straight, clean. Ahead, Graylock Hall waited with a blank expression. If places were capable of thought, this building cared about nothing. It knew it would have him eventually. The boy in the chair was simply another meal, one more soul to sit in a waiting room that would never be full. He was inside. Tiled walls rushed by, fast then faster, until the journey was indistinguishable from a roller coaster ride. Space Mountain, Star Wars. Light speed. Neil wanted to scream, but he realized that his mouth had been clamped shut. Leather straps wrapped his skull from crown to jaw. The chair finally came to a stop in front of a closed door. Green paint flecked off its metal surface. From inside the room, he could hear someone crying, weeping, emitting great, gasping sighs. He squeezed his eyes shut, not wanting to see who was in there. But even through his eyelids, he watched the door swing slowly open. Someone pushed the chair into the room, then slammed the door closed with a whoom. Through a high window, a cloud of daylight fell, illuminating the center of the small room, but leaving its corners in shadow. The walls, the ceiling, and the floor were all dingy, puffy, and padded, once white. Flicking his eyes back and forth, Neil noticed long scrapes in the old pads where patients had clawed at the walls, trying to escape. Dark brown streaks painted the edges of the gouged fabric. He imagined broken fingernails, dried blood that no one had ever bothered to clean up. Then, from a shadowed corner, something moved. A voice cried out, no words, a sign of frustration, a sob of misery, hopelessness. The light shifted. Someone was sitting there in the darkness, as if in her own mess, huddled head down, dressed in white. A coat with abnormally long sleeves pinned the person's arms to her torso. Stringy, long hair covered her face, draped almost to the floor. Her shoulders shuddered. Neil grunted, and the person froze, as if suddenly aware of his presence. The figure raised her head, peering at him from behind the wild tangle of hair. She gasped, leaned back against the padded wall, struggled to stand. Then she stumbled forward, barefoot, step, 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 all the way to his wheelchair, threatening to fall face first into Neil's chest. He pressed himself into his seat, unable to move, unable to cry out. The person froze, examined him closely, sniffing at his face, his restraints. With the figure directly before him, Neil expected to smell rot, filth, stale breath. Instead, he experienced a recognizable aroma, not unpleasant. Roses. His mother's perfume. A lightning bolt of nausea melted his muscles. The woman shook her head from her face. Though the eyes that peered at him were puffy and red from weeping, they were instantly recognizable, even this desperate and widely ecstatic. "Honey," whispered his mother. "Neil, baby, you've got to get us out of here." But how, he thought. As if to answer him, she opened her mouth. A purple tongue lolled out, dripping nauseous black liquid. This was no longer his mother's face. She leaned in as if to kiss him, but at the last second her cracked lips parted, showing him black gums and several clusters of long, sharp teeth, the brightest white in the darkness. Neil awoke with a start, and when he did not recognize the room, he cried out quietly. A moment later, his brain clicked everything into place again. He was at his aunt's house. He'd had a nightmare. A bad one. He let it slip away, but several pieces stuck. The padded room, the figure in the corner, his mother's plea. The horrible face. He took a deep breath, wishing for the glass of water he always remembered to keep next to his bed back home. He froze, suddenly aware that he wasn't alone. Someone was crying. Here in his room. The faint sound seemed to have followed him out from the dream. But he wasn't dreaming. In the darkness, he could make out a slumped figure sitting at the end of the bed. She wore a white nightgown. Long brown hair trailed down her back. Her hands were at her face, muffling her soft sobs. "Bree," Neil said, "what's the matter?" She flinched at the sound of his voice, then turned to look at him. Her face was in shadow, but he felt her piercing stare, as if she couldn't believe he could actually see her here in the darkness. "Did you have a bad dream too?" He leaned forward to touch her shoulder, but she stood. Watching him, she backed toward the bedroom door, where she paused before slipping away. She was gone before Neil even had a chance to think of turning on the bedside lamp. He threw back his sheets and slowly edged toward the door. Near the end of the bed, his bare feet slid on a slick patch of floor. The wood there was wet. What the... He imagined a pool of tears. Had his sister been crying so hard for so long? Was that even possible? Neil bent down. His fingers tingled as the cold moisture clung to his skin. Definitely water. Clutching the mattress to pull himself back up, he realized that his bed was also damp. Had Bree just taken a bath or something? It felt like the middle of the night, but he couldn't say for sure. The clock at his bedside had apparently run out of batteries. Neil found his way to the hall. He knocked on his sister's door. There was no answer. He turned the knob, pressing his mouth to the crack. "Bree," he whispered. From inside came a soft groan. Neil pushed the door open and stepped in. Bree was sprawled across the mattress, her sheets and limbs tangled together. She lifted her head from the pillow. "Neil?" she said, her voice foggy with sleep. "What are you doing?" Neil felt a chill. His shin suddenly pinched at him. "I just came to see if you were okay." "I'm fine. I was sleeping." "Sleepwalking, you mean?" Bree propped herself up on her elbows to see him more clearly. She reached over and turned on her lamp. The room filled with a cozy glow. Sleepwalking? I don't think so. Neil flinched. You were sitting on the edge of my bed. You were crying so hard the floor was wet. You were dreaming, said Bree, sounding annoyed. I swear I wasn't, he answered. I bet my... Then he noticed something odd. Bree was wearing a purple t-shirt and gym shorts. Definitely not the white nightgown she'd had on in his bedroom. That chill enveloped him again. He wiped new dampness from his clammy palms onto his pajama pants. You bet your what? Said Bree. He was going to say life and was glad he stopped himself. It was a bet he would have lost. Moving toward Bree's bed, he pointed to a dark spot on her sheets. What's this? Bree sat up. She touched the stain. Ew, it's damp. I found the same thing in my room, Neil said. Bree bit her lip. You swear you're not screwing with me? No way, said Neil. She was here. Who was here? Neil had a pretty good idea, but he couldn't bring himself to say her name out loud, as if that would draw her back again. Instead, he explained exactly what had happened to him when he'd awoken from his nightmare. Bree hopped out of bed and stood next to Neil, as if this new closeness would protect them from their fear. What do we do? Bree asked. Tell the ants? And freak them out too? Maybe it was one of them? Claire or Anna snuck into both of our rooms and sat on our beds, soaking wet, crying her eyes out. Bree shook her head. You really believe that? No, but what's the other option? Neil could think of several, none of which provided him with any comfort. Bree must have felt the same way because she did not answer. Chapter 13. Neil had heard stories about people who suffered from insomnia, the inability to fall asleep despite a feeling of extreme exhaustion. The morning after the nightmare, he knew exactly how those people felt. Horrible. Sitting at the kitchen table, his eyes burned. His scalp hurt as if every follicle in his head was angry with him. It was cruel, but knowing that Bree was experiencing the same thing made Neil feel a bit better. She sat across from him, leaning on the table, propping her head on her crossed arms. The night before, she'd come back to his room with him. They kept the light on, lying restlessly on his bed until early morning light spilled through the windows. The ants found the two of them a couple hours later, sprawled half-conscious on the couch downstairs, the television blaring an obnoxious aerobics program. The incident with the visitor accounted for only part of Neil's sleep-depriving anxiety. Mostly, he was afraid that if he allowed himself to fall fully asleep, he'd return to that padded cell in the dream asylum where the purple-tongued demoness was waiting to finish her meal. So the beds are uncomfortable, Anna said, placing the carton of orange juice in the center of the table. No, Bree shook her head. They're really comfortable. Claire and Anna glanced at each other. Then why were you two down here? Anna asked. The silence that followed was as sharp as a knife. Why couldn't he just spit it out? Finally, Neil decided he could. After all, maybe the ants had answers. Actually, he said, someone came into our rooms last night and sort of freaked us out. Again, a glance between the ants. This one, however, was of confusion. And it revealed the answer to a question he hadn't even asked. It wasn't either of us, it said. Someone, said Claire. She had long brown hair, said Neil, dressed in what I thought was a white nightgown. But it might have been something else, a uniform maybe. And you both saw her? Anna asked. Bree lifted her head. Well, no, but there was a puddle on my floor. Anna scowled. Neil, please! Your sister doesn't need you playing jokes on her like this. Neil's face flushed. It's not like that. He glanced at Bree for help, but she was looking at him as if considering that Anna might be onto something. We think the woman might have been, well, a ghost. Now Anna glared at Claire. All that talk about Graylock yesterday, she murmured. Claire sat down at the table. She reached out and took both of their hands. You guys, she said, I want you to talk to us if you're feeling upset or strange about everything that's been going on back home. Anna and I understand that this is a really difficult time for you, for your mom and your dad. Neil grunted. No one seemed to notice. He chewed on the inside of his lip, annoyed. He'd worked up the courage to tell them what was really happening. Why did Claire have to change the subject? Thanks, said Bree. We know it's hard for you too, having us here. But what about the possibility of a ghost? Neil interrupted. Slowly, everyone turned to look at him. You told us about what you saw at Graylock Lake, Aunt Claire. The woman in the reeds. What if that was Nurse Janet? What if she followed... maybe the person we saw last night was her too? Nurse Janet? Said Claire unsurely. Anna snorted and shook her head. She's a boogie woman. A ghost story someone made up to keep kids in line. I heard she worked at that hospital, Neil persisted. They say she still haunts it. That she drowns kids who break into Graylock Hall. She kills them just like she killed her patients when she was still alive. Neil! Bree said through her teeth. If that's true, said Anna, squinting at him, whatever was she doing here last night? According to you, Neil, she comes after kids who break into Graylock, right? Claire stood up. Okay, all right, enough ghost talk. We don't want anyone having bad dreams again tonight. It wasn't a bad dream, said Neil, right before remembering the extremely bad dream that had woken him up in the first place. I don't care if it was acid indigestion, said Anna. The Nurse Santa story is a lie that was started by parents who had good, if not slightly warped intentions, to keep the doors of that creepy building locked tight. No one should be going in there, not anymore. Neil pressed his lips together. You've got to get us out of here, his mother had insisted in the dream from the night before. If learning the truth about Nurse Janet could prove that she had come to him, that she hadn't imagined it, that he wasn't taking after his mom, then he didn't care what building he had to sneak into. No one would stop him. Chapter 14. After breakfast, Bree decided to stay behind and help Anna out in her ceramic studio, which was tucked discreetly inside the ramshackle barn that stood behind the aunt's house. Claire insisted that Neil accompany her to the pie shop, where she assured him that she would reveal all of her baking secrets. Neil had no choice but to follow, even though he couldn't have cared less about the secret of pie. Before they got in the car, he grabbed the satchel from the chair next to his bed, wondering whether he'd have the opportunity to hunt for haunts. As they pulled out of the driveway, Neil half expected to see Nurse Janet standing with a wide grin at the side of the road, her thumb extended to hitch a ride. He closed his eyes until they were nearly at the shop, which was already bustling with Claire's employees. In the kitchen, Claire introduced Neil to the head pastry chef, Glenn Kelly, a tall and surprisingly skinny man with a big smile who wore a pristine white apron over a t-shirt and jeans. His assistant was a college-age girl named Melissa Diaz, also thin with wide hips and a chest Neil knew he should not be staring at. She apparently couldn't be bothered to glance at Neil for more than 3 seconds. Manning the register in the shop itself was a thin-necked high school boy, Lyle Peters, whose eyes were still puffy with sleep. When Claire approached the shop's front doors to unbolt the locks, a small crowd swished in, money in hand. Neil lounged to one of the booths, wishing he could leave, but Claire had told him she didn't want him wandering off alone, glancing at his bandaged leg as she said it. The longer he sat there by himself, the easier it was for his parents to creep back inside his head. As strange as it sounded, he'd rather be visited by the weeping woman from the night before than to dream of his mother in the padded cell ever again. "Hey, Neil!" A voice called from the back of the shop. Melissa stood in the kitchen doorway. "We need some help with this crust! Get off your butt!" Neil wasn't sure whether to smile or scowl. Claire stood behind the cash register, pointedly ignoring him. He followed Melissa as he turned away, unsure of what he was getting himself into. A couple hours later, Neil was covered with flour and proud of it. He'd rolled out at least 20 crusts and pinched them into single pie plates. Glenn had complimented him on his technique, and eventually Melissa had to admit that, at the very least, he was a fast learner. "What happened to your leg?" Melissa asked him when Glenn was out of earshot. "Look serious." "Oh, this?" Neil glanced at his bandage. "I was out at... Whoops." He'd almost just told this girl what had actually happened. He had to be careful. Her appearance was distracting. "You were out at what?" "The woods. I had tripped over a log." Melissa laughed, then covered her mouth. "Ha ha! I'm sorry, a log?" She became mock serious. "Are you a klutz? Should I be worried about having you here in the kitchen?" "No, I'm not a klutz." Neil could feel his face turning red. "I just didn't see it there." "So what you're saying is the log attacked you?" Neil pressed his lips together. He knew she was just teasing him. Still. "Actually, I fell through the floor out at Graylock Hall." He blurted out. "Graylock?" Melissa flinched. Instead of being mock serious, she now looked truly serious, maybe even a little frightened. "I went yesterday with my sister and some friends. And now for the clincher. We snuck in through a window." "What were you thinking? And who are these friends? I thought you weren't from here." "Wesley and Eric Baptist." He regretted saying their name immediately. What if Melissa told on them? "Really?" Melissa softened. "Eric went with you?" "You know him?" Melissa nodded. "He's in my little brother's band. We actually went out a couple years ago. I was a senior. He was a sophomore. He's pretty cute." Neil didn't know what to say. The best he could think of was, "I'm pretty sure my sister would agree with you." "Well, tell your sister to stay away from him if she values her sanity," said Melissa, turning back to the pie crusts. Oh, Neil thought, she does. We both do. "Trust me," Melissa added. "Cute does not always mean sweet." I think Bree figured that out already. "Neil!" Claire popped her head through the doorway and called out through the din. "You've got a visitor!" Neil leaned close to Melissa. "Don't tell anyone what I told you, about Graylock." Melissa raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" "I don't want anyone to get in trouble, please." Melissa smiled. "You know the best way to keep a secret?" Neil shook his head. "Never tell anyone, period." Carrying his satchel, Neil wandered out to the cafe section of the shop. He found Wesley standing just inside the front door, sweating through his bright orange tie-dyed t-shirt. Claire had given him a cup of water. Outside, Neil saw Wesley's bike propped against the cafe's large front window. The events of the previous day careened back into Neil's brain, and he realized that the pie shop had so consumed him he hadn't even thought about the nighttime visitor since Melissa had asked him to help with the crusts. "Hey there," said Wesley. "I called your house. Your sister told me you were here." "Cool," said Neil. "I'm glad you came." "She said you had something to tell me." Wesley clasped the water cup tightly, looking as if he expected to hear a mind-blowing story. "I sure do." Neil called out to his aunt, who was behind the counter chatting with Lyle. "Aunt Claire, can I take a break?" Claire said, glancing up. When she saw Wesley, she smiled. "You're going together, right?" "Just at the playground," said Wesley. Over on Bennett Street. Don't be too long. We won't, said Neil, already reaching for the doorknob. Chapter 15. As they walked several blocks toward Bennett Street, passing quiet houses and overgrown gardens, ramshackle fences, and cars and gravel driveways that looked as if they'd been abandoned, Neil told Wesley what had happened the night before. Wesley nearly fell down with excitement. Nurse Anna totally followed you home. I'm not sure that's something to stir about, said Neil. Doesn't the legend say that she looked for new victims to drown? Wesley grew somber. Oh, yeah, I forgot about that part. At Bennett, they took a left and encountered a large field. The playground stood at the crest of a nearby hill. Once they'd reached the blanket of green grass, they began to climb. Shoot, said Neil. I still don't have camera batteries. I wanted to check out the pictures from yesterday. What kind of batteries do you need? Asked Wesley, racing down the empty swing set at the top of the slope. Not sure, said Neil, trying to keep up. AA? When they reached the playground, Wesley leaped into the seat of a swing. His momentum carried him swiftly backwards and up. Grasping a chain with one hand, he reached into his pocket with the other. When he swung back toward Neil, he showed him what he brought, 2 small cylinders marked AA. Will these work? Neil smiled and then jumped back so that Wesley wouldn't kick him in the chest. Those will totally work. You could thank Bree. She was the one who reminded me. I pulled them out of our TV remote, so it'd still have some juice left. Here, catch. Neil sat on the still swing beside Wesley and carefully opened the slot in the side of the camera. After replacing the old batteries with the newest ones, Neil took a deep breath and then pressed the power button. A second later, the lens whirred open as the view screen blinked on. Yes, said Neil. Thank you, Wesley. Wesley dropped his feet to the worn-out ground and skidded to a stop. So, what you get? Neil hit the review button, and an image popped up on the screen, a brightly lit doorknob. This was the last picture, room 13. Wait, he said. Let's start from the beginning. He selected the slideshow function, and suddenly the 2 boys were watching a recap of the previous day's misadventure, film strip style. The first few pictures showed the front of the hospital, the circular drive, the ivy, the solid main entrance doors. The sky was blue, the light was golden. The shots revealed nothing about the secrets locked inside. In fact, the place looked almost pretty. Next, the camera showed the gymnasium, the warped floorboards, the decaying ceiling. This was more like it. Still, Neil saw nothing that might be paranormal. No mists, no floating orbs, no shadows filled with faces. The only faces that appeared were in the group shot of Wesley, Bree, and Eric huddled together underneath one of the basketball hoops. They journeyed up the dark stairs to the labyrinth of hallways. Chipped tiles, dusty gurneys, toppled wheelchairs. There was one particularly disturbing picture of a large black spider, but no ghosts, not yet. The youth ward appeared with its giant sunlit windows. There were pictures of the cake table, the rack of stuffed animals. In one shot of the stairwell, a small bulb of light hovered near the top of the screen, but Neil could not be certain whether or not it was merely a speck of dust. That was the problem with orbs. According to Alexi and Mark, they were very inconsistent phenomena. Then the camera showed them the doorknob picture again, shiny bluish-white, overexposed. They'd reached the end. Neil felt faint with annoyance. That's it? Said Wesley, standing. No ghosts. Are you sure you guys didn't just imagine seeing something in the room with you? He began to pace in front of the swing set. I thought I was sure, said Neil, but maybe we were wrong. A light flickered at his hand. Neil glanced back at the camera. The slideshow had progressed. On the screen, a new image stared up at them. A taxidermic deer head hanging on a wood panel wall, wide antlers reaching toward a soot-stained ceiling. What the heck? Said Neil. He didn't remember taking this picture. Wesley stared at him from the far swing, looking concerned. The slideshow continued on. The next shot revealed what appeared to be a piano bench. A stack of sheet music stood precariously on the edge, ready to topple. The top seat read Superstition, music by Stevie Wonder. In another picture was a fireplace. 3 decorative birch logs were arranged just so upon a set of plain Adirons. "What is it?" Wesley asked, rushing back. But by the time he reached Neil's shoulder, the screen had turned blue. The slideshow was over. Neil stared at the camera for several seconds. Then he quickly told Wesley what he'd seen. "You sure those socks aren't from your aunt's house? Maybe someone took them last night after you got home." "I'm positive," said Neil, feeling queasy. "And besides, the camera wasn't working last night, remember?" "Let me see." Neil scrolled quickly through the pictures. The catalog of Graylock photographs appeared, but the last 3, the ones Neil didn't remember taking, were now missing. "They were right here," said Neil, totally confused. The screen went black. A gust of wind rustled the grass all the way down the hill. Neil clutched the camera tightly. He felt a hand against the small of his back. He turned to look at Wesley, who clearly was not touching him. Neil felt pressure between his shoulder blades. His sneakers dragged forward as the swing began to move. Neil turned his head to see who was pushing him. No one was there. Neil leaped off the seat and ran from the swing set. The swing beside Wesley moved back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, as if someone had taken his place. Then the swing suddenly stopped. The chains hung straight down. Neil almost fell backward, but caught himself just in time. "Someone pushed me," he said. Wesley stared at the seat in astonishment. For some reason, Neil turned and glanced down the hill. In the middle of the street, 100 yards away, a figure was watching him. She was dressed in white. He held his hand above his eyes to shield the sun, but he couldn't make out her face. Fingers clutched his wrist, and Neil shrieked. It was Wesley. Wesley laughed and then said, "What are you looking at?" "That woman," Neil pointed, but the street was empty. His skin felt as if it had been replaced by sandpaper. He was itchy all over. "What woman?" Wesley stepped forward. "Neil, you're acting weird." "She was right there. Don't tell me I was the only one who saw her. Sorry." Neil didn't want to hear any more. He tossed the camera back into the satchel. "I'm not imagining things. Let's go find her." The boys explored every alley on the way back, but they found no woman wearing a white uniform. When they burst through the shop's front doors, several customers looked up at them. Neil realized that his chest was heaving and his eyes were wide. He slipped into the booth near the front door, where he put his head in his hands, trying impossibly to hide. He couldn't come in here acting like a total freak, but that's exactly how he felt. Even Wesley Green Man Baptist was looking at him funny. He'd hoped that seeing the ghost again would take him away from everything of which he was frightened. Now he was worried that he was seeing things. First, the phantom photos in the camera, and then the woman in the street. "You've got to get us out of here," his dream mother had said. But it seemed Neil had only traveled further into the padded room. Claire waved at the boys as the cafe's phone rang. She picked it up. Thankfully, she hadn't noticed their dramatic entrance. "What do we do?" Wesley whispered. "We have to tell Bree," said Neil. "Eric, too," said Wesley. "Maybe they'll have an idea about those extra pictures. Try the camera again." Neil pulled the device out from the bag, but the screen wouldn't change from black no matter how many times he hit the power button. He shook his head, disappointed. Dead batteries, again. This had to mean the woman he'd seen in the street had been a spirit, didn't it? He clicked open the camera's small side panel, slid the batteries out, and handed them back to Wesley. "You don't think I'm crazy, do you?" he asked. Before Wesley could answer, Claire approached and slid into the booth next to him. "So," she said, "it turns out we're having a party tonight, and guess what?" "What?" the boys asked at the same time. "You're both invited." Chapter 16. Every month, the aunts and their friends got together to drink and eat and watch their favorite best bad movies. With the arrival of their niece and nephew that week, Claire and Anna had forgotten that the movie night was upon them. And worse, it was their turn to host. A group of at least 8 adults would be showing up around 7:30 that evening, expecting hors d'oeuvres. After a stop at the grocery store, Neil felt a chill as he walked through their aunt's front door. He wasn't sure if he was ready to meet their friends. What if they asked him why he was staying in Hedston for the summer? Claire followed Neil into the house, calling out, "Anna, turn on the oven. We found some frozen snakes." Anna peeked her head out from the kitchen. "Frozen?" She screwed up her face. Neil stood at the bottom of the foyer staircase, holding a paper grocery bag. His cheeks burned with embarrassment. "Easy there," said Claire, lugging the rest of the load down the hall. "Neil picked out the menu, and I have complete trust in him." He couldn't help but smile at that. Claire was actually pretty cool. He decided then that he needed to start giving her more of a chance. A bang sounded upstairs, followed by a frightened scream. Neil grabbed the banister, steadying himself. Claire and Anna raced from the kitchen, looking up at the ceiling. "Bree," Claire called, "everything okay?" Bree careened to the top of the staircase and dashed halfway down before realizing that everyone was there staring at her. I, she stammered, trembling, unable to continue. Anna raced to the bottom of the steps, nearly knocking Neil out of the way. She climbed the stairs, meeting Bree where she stood. She grabbed her shoulders and gave a brief hug. "Honey," she said calmly, "what's wrong?" Bree took a deep breath. "I was in the bathroom. I lifted the toilet seat." Neil wasn't sure he wanted to hear the rest of this. "And inside," Bree shuddered, "snakes." That is not what Neil was expecting her to say. "Oh my God," said Claire. "Like tons and tons of long green snakes." Bree seemed to become aware of herself. She held her palms in front of her face, rubbing at her eyes. "I'm sorry, I'm acting like a kid." Anna steadied herself, glancing up the stairs with shoulders squared, as if she had to deal with this kind of thing every day. "I'm not going back in there," said Bree, wriggling away from Anna, descending the rest of the steps to stand by Neil. But now Neil was curious. "I'll go," he said, following Anna up the stairs. Bree had managed to close the bathroom door in her desperate scramble to escape the alleged toilet snakes. Anna and Neil stood in the hallway, staring at the knob, worried together what might happen when they pushed the door open. Would a mass of wriggling green serpents spill forth, mouths open wide, fangs dripping with venom, ready to chomp their ankles? Would they make a good snake-stomping duo? Anna certainly looked as if she was ready to destroy something. She pressed her ear to the door, then shook her head. "I don't hear anything." She glanced at Neil. "Feeling brave, kiddo?" Neil nodded even though he wasn't sure. He reached out, turned the knob, and pushed. A light bulb glowed dimly from the ceiling above, Bree obviously having forgotten to turn it off. The toilet sat beside a purple porcelain clawfoot bathtub. Of course, the lid was down. Anna crept forward, reaching for the bowl scrubber perched just behind the pipes next to the tub. A weapon. Neil stayed behind her now, happy that Anna had decided to become the brave one here. He heard a rustling sound from the hall, and he turned to find Claire watching from just outside the door. Standing several feet from the toilet, Anna used the scrubber handle as a prop, slowly raising both the lid and the seat. They clinked against the water tank beside the bowl. From where he stood, Neil could not see over the lip. He looked at Anna's face to get a clue what was inside. She looked disgusted and confused, but not afraid. "What the—" Anna whispered. Stepping closer, she used the scrubber to reach inside the bowl. Once he lifted it, tentatively, slowly, something long, green, and slightly fuzzy hung from the scrubber's plastic bristles. Lakeweed! How the heck did that get in there? Said Claire, stepping onto the bathroom. Neil's mouth went dry. He clenched his fingers against his palms, trying to stop them from going numb. He leaned forward to get a better view. He needed to see exactly what his sister had seen. The toilet bowl was filled with long strands of the nauseous-looking grass bunched up in clumps. They looked almost alive in the water, serpent-like. The weed was the same type he'd seen one day earlier, swirling just below the surface of the lake out by Graylock Hall. Chapter 17. Strange things happen out here in the country, said Anna, arranging small quiches on a baking tray next to the open oven door. Neil and Bree worked near the sink, mixing a packet of ranch dip with a carton of sour cream. A long time ago, when I told my family I was moving to New York City from Nowheresville, Pennsylvania, they asked me if I was scared. I guess I was, but the city is a particular kind of scary, where you have several simple rules to stay safe. Watch your back, be aware of your surroundings, don't ride the subway alone late at night. I even carried around a can of pepper spray, which thankfully I never used. When I left New York to move up here with Claire, my friends had the same reaction that my family had when I got to the city. Are you scared? Anna slid the tray into the oven and closed the door. To be honest, I find the country to be much more frightening. Up here, you never know what you're going to get. So it's nearly impossible to prepare the way you can in the city. Mysterious sounds in the woods at night, strange lights in the sky. Lakewind in the pipes, said Bree, brushing again. She cleaned the stringy grass out of the toilet bowl herself, embarrassed that she'd caused such a scene. And no one can hear you scream, said Claire in a low, dramatic voice. She opened a cupboard and pulled down a stack of mismatched china plates. I know people who are scared by the sound of nighttime crickets. She laughed. We got used to it fairly quickly. You find ways to feel less alone, mostly by maintaining the few friendships you have, by getting together with people who understand you. Seems to me that you guys have plenty of friends, said Bree, popping a piece of celery into her mouth. Speaking of which, Anna said, glancing at the clock above the refrigerator, those friends will be here soon. Television's working, right? It was working this morning, said Bree. That's right, said Claire. Are you two planning on getting up at the crack of dawn again tomorrow? Neil blinked, thinking to himself, hopefully we won't have a reason to. He watched his sister out of the corner of his eye. She wore a blank smile, appearing to have recovered entirely from the great toilet snake incident. He wondered if she'd be so cool with he and Wesley told her everything that had happened that day. The doorbell rang. The first of the guests had arrived. Others quickly followed. Neil recognized a few of them from the pie shop. Soon, a small din rose from the living room, where the adults sat and ate and drank and laughed. Claire and Anna introduced Neil and Bree to everyone, and thankfully no one asked about their mother or father. The guests all seemed genuinely pleased to meet them. There was a young couple, Barry and Libba, who had driven 45 minutes from outside of Albany. An older woman, Gladys, whose black dress was covered with white cat hair. A few other shop owners from downtown Hedston. A quiet man named Olivier, who sometimes helped Anna in her studio. Last but not least was Andy, the man who had come upon the battered, bloody group the day before. Today, he was dressed in a black polo shirt, dark jeans, and work boots. Cleaned up from the plaid-shirted woodsman look he'd worn when they met him. He smiled mischievously at Neil and Bree when they realized why they recognized him.
How's that leg feeling? Andy asked. It's better, said Neil, his heart racing. He didn't feel like telling the story of his injury to this group of strangers, but Andy was kind enough to drop it. What movie are you all watching? Bree asked, boldly sitting beside Gladys, risking a staticky cat hair transfer. Aren't you going to watch it too? Gladys asked. Depends on what it is. It's the host's choice, said Andy, waving for Claire and Anna to answer. Sitting on the arm of the couch, Claire turned toward Bree. We have some ground rules. This is best bad movie night, remember? The film has to be campy, trashy, scary, over the top. It has to be at least as old as any of us. We try to weed out anything too gory or nasty. Sometimes unsuccessfully, said Andy, laughing. All that being said, Claire continued, I pulled a classic from my personal catalog that, for some reason, this group has not experienced together. Everyone leaned forward as if Claire was about to spill a life-changing secret. Whatever happened to Baby Jane? The room filled with oohs and ahs and a couple groans. Now, said Gladys. Host get final say. We didn't have a lot of time to plan, Anna muttered, almost to herself. I've never heard of it, said Neil. Never heard of Baby Jane? Anna's mouth dropped open. She continued excitedly. Betty Davis plays a psychotic former child actress who locks up her paralyzed sister, played by Joan Crawford, in a decaying Hollywood mansion. When Neil and Bree stared back blankly, she went on. Oh, come on. You must have seen the dead rat on a dinner plate scene somewhere on the internet. What else is YouTube good for but silly little things like that? Stop, Anna. You'll spoil it for them, said Claire. Dead rats on dinner plates? Neil cringed. The word psychotic made him nervous. Are you convinced to watch with us now, Bree? Said Gladys, smirking. There was a knock at the door. Wesley. Finally, Neil leaped up from his chair. I'll get it. When Neil opened the door, he was surprised to find Eric standing beside his brother. Hey, Neil, Eric said. Looking good. Better than the last time I saw you. Wesley looked a little embarrassed. He borrowed Mom's car to drive me. Is it all right if he stays? Neil glanced into the living room. Bree's antennae were up. She craned her neck to see who he was talking to. Neil forced a smile. Sir, he said to the brothers, come on in. Chapter 18. Neil led Wesley and Eric into the kitchen, offering them something to drink. Curious, Bree snuck in behind them. Accepting a glass of Coke from Neil, Eric glanced into the living room. This is weird, he said, then took a swig. I can get you something else instead, said Neil. Not the Coke, said Eric. Them. He nodded at the small group of adults. What are all they doing here? Having fun, said Bree, crossing her arms. What are you doing here? Wesley took a step toward Neil as if bracing himself for an explosion. Eric frowned. Placing the glass on the counter, he said, I'm sorry, did I do something to you? Bree shrugged. Besides leaving us alone in an abandoned mental hospital? I didn't leave you alone. You went off by yourself. Neil got hurt. We're lucky it wasn't worse. You're right, said Eric. It could have been worse, but it wasn't, so what's your problem? I don't understand why you come to someone's house for a party and then call everyone weird, that's all. Maybe this is why your band kicked you out. You seem a little bit insensitive. They didn't kick me out, Eric said, exasperated. I quit. Guys, said Neil, waving them quiet. But Eric went on. To answer your question, Wesley asked me to come inside. That's why I'm here. I wasn't planning on staying. Wesley finally spoke up. We need to talk, all of us, together. Bree and Eric paused and then looked at Wesley as if he'd poked them with a stick. Something happened today, said Neil nervously. Something really weird. He told Eric about the ghostly visitor the night before, about the puddle of water at the end of his and Bree's beds. He explained that an invisible hand had pushed them on the playground swing, that a woman dressed in white had vanished while watching them from Bennett Street. He described the pictures that had disappeared from the camera and the weeds that had come through the pipes into the upstairs bathroom. When Neil was done, an uncomfortable silence hung in the kitchen. What if something happened when we went to Graylock yesterday? Neil added, lowering his voice. Is it crazy to think that whatever happened in room 13 followed us home? Nurse Janet? Said Eric, as if considering the possibility for the first time. I can't stop thinking about the legend, said Neil, that her ghost drowned kids out in the lake. Bree held her hand up to her mouth. Eric dropped the cocky mask he'd worn since he'd arrived. They both looked truly frightened. Neil felt oddly pleased with their reaction. At the very least, it made his theory seem reasonable. You think she's toying with you? Asked Eric. Neil's pleasure was brief. If they were being haunted, then he wasn't imagining things. However, Nurse Janet wasn't exactly the kind of spirit Neil wanted lurking around his bedroom late at night. There's got to be something we can do to stop her, said Wesley. Oh, really? Said Bree. How exactly do we stop a ghost? A ghost? Said a voice from the doorway. How exciting! The four of them spun around. Gladys, the cat hair lady, stood there smiling at them, holding an empty wine glass. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. She took up the bottle from the kitchen table. Oh, your aunts wanted me to tell you that they're starting the movie. Looking directly into Neil's eyes, she said, I think you're going to like this one. Neil sat on the couch next to Wesley. Halfway through, he was fairly certain that old actress's pale face would haunt his dreams, and that voice. If he ever heard her muttering in the dark of his bedroom, he knew he'd scream to wake the neighbors, no matter how far away they lived out here in the country. Near the end of the movie, Neil went to the kitchen for a drink and stayed there until it was over. While the adults talked about the film, Wesley came and found him. Let's take a walk, he whispered. They snuck out the front door with Eric and Bree. On the porch, Eric stood close to Bree and said, We need a plan. I have a suggestion, said Bree, feigning excitement. We could go to the store and just buy some ghost repellent. She dropped her smile and crossed her arms, glaring at Bree. I hear it's cheaper if we just order online, he answered with a smirk. Bree clenched her fists. We do have a ghost expert here, said Wesley, stepping between them. Neil knows what to do, right, Neil? Put on the spot, Neil suddenly felt his throat start to close up. His mind went blank. I'll check the Ghostly Investigator's website. I'm sure they'll have a few good suggestions. I have one, said Eric. First, how about we confirm that we're actually dealing with something supernatural? Neil flinched. What do you mean? Ghosts are supernatural. Yeah, but you're the only one who's seen it. How do we know you're telling the truth? I'm telling the truth, Neil said, unable to keep from sounding annoyed. You think you are, at least. The ground started to feel wobbly. Neil grabbed hold of the porch railing. Eric! Wesley whispered, horrified. Look, said Bree, stepping closer to Eric. If my brother says he saw a ghost, he saw a ghost. We didn't ask for your help. Eric's mouth dropped open. I didn't mean anything by it, but I'm only saying, it doesn't matter what you're saying, said Bree, because we're no longer listening. Chapter 19. After Eric and Wesley drove off, Neil sat on the front steps with his sister, taking in the sounds of the night, a totally different experience than in New Jersey. Up here in the Catskills wilderness, the wind through the trees had a voice that wasn't drowned out by the constant drone of engines on the turnpike. Neil and Bree gazed at the stars, which sighed clearly overhead, a burst of fireworks frozen in the night sky. At home, only half as many were visible, hidden behind a red haze that leaked like an algae bloom from the lights of New York City across the Hudson River. Here, they could see how things were supposed to be. Sorry I made your friends leave, said Bree, staring at her feet. It's okay. Thanks for sticking up for me. Bree glanced at him quickly. I called Mom today. Neil shuddered, unable to control himself. He smacked at his arms, trying to pass off his reaction to his battle with the mosquito. She picked up? He asked, hoping he didn't sound desperate. No, but I left a message. I told her that we're thinking about her. But I'm trying not to think about her, Neil thought. Bree tried to take his hand, but he snatched it away, pretending this time that a mosquito was buzzing near his leg. When he looked, there actually was a mosquito buzzing around. Several. Quite a few, in fact. We're gonna get eaten if we stay out here, he said. They stood and went to the door. Voices came through the screen. Shh, said Bree, holding Neil back. They listened. Oh, I don't think they thought of the movie that way, said Anna from the living room, her voice hushed. Stop being such a drama queen, Claire. Okay, said Claire. All I'm saying is that next time, maybe we should think a little bit harder about the movies we decide to watch in front of these kids. What are they talking about? Neil whispered. Bree sighed. What do you think, dummy? Us. I'm sorry, said Gladys. I don't understand. The Baby Jane character is nothing like Linda. Why would they even be upset? I was just thinking out loud, said Claire. After what they did yesterday, breaking into that hospital and everything. Neil felt his stomach hit the floor. Bree grabbed his arm. They knew about the trip to Graylock? Who told them? Had it been Andy, Dr. Simon? Melissa Diaz had been the only other person Neil had mentioned it to. Then how they slept last night or didn't sleep. Something weird's going on. I can't explain it. Something weird? Said Anna. An understatement, Claire, my dear. Their father's completely out of the picture. Their mother basically kicked him out of her house for the summer. I'm surprised they haven't spontaneously combusted. Especially with the two of us tiptoeing around, Claire added. I've never felt so clueless. I'm beginning to wonder if they wouldn't be better off with my brother in New Jersey. Neil squeezed his mouth shut, hoping to keep inside the groan he felt bubbling from his gut. Kids are unpredictable, said Andy, his voice even, soothing. When my wife went away, my daughter was a complete wreck. I really have to commend you two for trying to pick up the pieces here. I wouldn't put it that way, said Claire. We love those kids. We just want what's best. Neil and Bree seem pretty strong, said Gladys. Andy chuckled. I suppose you're right, Glad. That they went exploring Graylock Hall is almost quaint. On the other hand, if they start locking themselves in their rooms, refusing to speak, refusing to eat, then I would worry. He paused and sighed. You four will be fine. No matter what happens with Linda, trust me, I've been there, I know. Neil tried to pull away from Bree, but when he shifted his weight, the porch creaked, loudly. The voices inside went quiet. Nuts! He whispered, squeezing his eyes shut. Bree! Anna called. Neil! Bree took a few silent steps backward, getting as far away from the screen door as possible while remaining on the deck. We're outside, Aunt Anna! Then she treaded heavily back to the entry, making it sound as though they'd been far away from the conversation. Neil rolled his eyes, following behind, deciding to just go with it. But it turned out, once he'd come into the living room, it was as though the conversation hadn't taken place. Want some ice cream? Asked Claire, all her worries hidden behind her smile like stars in a light-polluted sky. Chapter 20. Neil ran through darkness. Someone was chasing him. He splashed into shallow water, tripped, then fell, reaching out and stopping himself before his face went under. The ground below the water's surface felt slimy, dank, a living kind of muck, as if the earth itself were trying to pull him down. He pulled back. Standing, he realized that he was knee-deep in the lake. Lily pads swirled around his legs, their long green stalks tangling around his calves. Rain sprinkled from a slate-black sky. Lightning flashed in the distance, revealing a horizon of sharp pine trees reflected in the lake below. A stone building on the shore shined brightly for a moment before disappearing quickly into the dark cloak of rain and wind. He knew where he was. Graylock, of course. Someone barreled through the brush behind him. A white light bounced in the black night air, reflecting harshly off the tall reeds, the water, the pine tree branches high above. The light blinded him. Neil froze, unable to think, unable to breathe. The muck was sucking on his feet. Whoever held the flashlight shined it directly into his face. He held up his hands, trying to make out who was on the other side of the beam, but all he could see was a bulky, featureless silhouette. The figure came at him, pushing him backward. Unprepared, Neil tumbled once more into the lake. This time he could not find the bottom, his hands caught in the lakeweed. He tried to jerk himself away from it, but the grass seemed to yank back. He tried to pluck the fuzzy strands away, but they tightened, anchoring him to the lake bed. He kicked, struggled to catch air, but he'd gone deeper than he expected. All around there was only water, water and the black of the beyond. He opened his mouth and darkness filled his lungs. Neil woke, choking, unable to catch his breath. A sensation of pins and needles pressed every inch of his skin. It hurt so much he clutched at his sweat-soaked sheets. Moments later, the feeling abated. His throat opened and he gasped. There was a knock on the door. "You okay in there?" Aunt Claire. His restlessness might have woken her too. He tried to speak, but his voice came out harsh, as if he'd gargled with concrete. "I think I had a bad dream." Claire pushed the door open. "Are you decent?" "I hope so," he said, his voice cracking. She came in and stood at the end of his bed. "I'm sorry," she said. "That stupid movie." "It wasn't the movie," said Neil. "I feel guilty," she said, ignoring his comment. "Let me get you some water. I'll stay for a while." Neil sighed. The room began to feel like a room again instead of a portal to another time and place. "You don't have to do that." "But I do, and I will," said his aunt, turning to go. "Be right back." As soon as he said it, Neil was glad. He really didn't want to be alone right now. In the morning, Claire was gone. Neil crawled groggily out from under his covers. Once again, he stepped into a cool puddle near the end of his bed. The water sent goosebumps from the soles of his feet to the top of his skull. His dream of the lake came back to him, along with the painful sensation of drowning, and a deeply unsettling thought dawned on him. It hadn't felt like a dream at all. It had felt much more like a memory of something that had actually happened. But it wasn't his memory, so whose was it? Neil shook his head in a clueless attempt to clear his mind. He dashed downstairs, still in his pajamas, hoping to find the others awake and about. The ants were sitting on the front porch, drinking orange juice. A cool morning breeze swept across the front lawn. Honeyed sunlight coated every green thing with a sweet glow. It was bound to be a gorgeous day. Claire and Anna glanced up at him as he pushed open the squeaky screen door. He blinked and said good morning, wiping his damp feet against the wood planks, removing evidence of the ghostly visitor. "Where's Bree?" Neil asked, sitting in a broken red Adirondack chair that leaned against the porch rail. "She's using the computer in my studio," said Anna. "Wanted to send some emails to her friends back in New Jersey." "Is it okay if I check my email too?" "Sure," said Anna. "But give Bree some space. She seemed a little upset this morning." This sparked Neil's curiosity. "Did she say why?" "Trouble sleeping again," Anna sighed. Don't worry, you guys will settle in soon. They were all quiet for a moment. I'm not worried, Neil lied. He opened the barn door just as Bree was reaching for it from the other side. She screamed in surprise, causing Neil to cry out a little bit himself. Watson, he wanted to tell her, but before he could say anything, he noticed that his sister looked pale and miserable. The skin below her eyes was dark, and she had a fresh pimple on her nose. Sorry, he said instead. Bree pointed toward the computer desk near the far wall. All yours, she said, brushing by him and stepping toward the house. Aunt Anna said you had another nightmare. Bree stopped, keeping her back toward him. So did I, he continued. I was being chased through the woods near Graylock. Someone pushed me into the water. I drowned. Bree turned. What little color was left in her cheeks drained from her face. I had the same dream, she said quietly, astonished. Neil had known somehow that she was going to say that. It felt real, she said. Like I couldn't breathe. It was terrifying. I couldn't breathe. I woke up choking, and this morning I nearly slipped in a puddle of water at the foot of my bed again. Do you think this is the proof we need? Neil asked, thinking of what Eric had said to him last night. You're the only one who's seen it. Proof of what? Bree stared at him blankly. Nurse Janet, said Neil. I'm not the only one who's seen her now. She chased us in the dream. What if she wants to hurt us in real life, just like the legend said? Don't be silly, Bree said, with an unconvincing laugh that sounded more like a grunt. I'm not being silly. What other answer is there? How's this for an answer? Bree glanced over her shoulder at the house, then lowered her voice even more. Since Dad hasn't returned my calls for the past couple days, I sent him an email. Neil threw his hands in the air in frustration. Before you freak out entirely, let me finish. I told him that I didn't want to stay with Aunt Claire and Anna. After what we heard them saying last night, it's obvious that they don't want us here. I asked him if we could go out to California, live with him instead, or at least try to figure out some other option, until Mom, feels better. For the second time that morning, Neil felt as if he could not breathe, this time out of rage. But he managed to control the tone of his voice. If living with him was an option, he would have made it happen already. Bree, don't be stupid. He doesn't want us, and honestly, I don't want him. I'm not being stupid. Her brow crinkled. Her pimple turned even redder. I just don't want to be here, especially with all this stuff going on. She peered over her shoulder into the woods. The trees were cool and unresponsive. Save for the breeze in the upper branches, they appeared to taunt by simply ignoring the rest of the anxious world. I can murder you for making me go to that place. To Graylock? Neil scoffed. I didn't make you go. As soon as Eric showed up, you practically dragged me. My big mistake, Bree said. Neil wasn't sure if she was talking about the trip to the hospital or her brief interest in Eric. Fine, said Neil. But don't come crying to me when Dad writes back and says, sorry, honey, Los Angeles is more expensive than I thought it would be. Face it, we're stuck here. No running away like Dad, or like Mom. We have to deal with this now, on our own. You deal with it then, said Bree. I'm done. No more nightmares, no more ghosts. I'm going to pick up a nice, fat romance novel from the library and hide out until all this Nurse Janet stuff blows over. Blows over? Stuff like this never blows over. Stuff like this follows you around. It finds you when you least expect it. The more you ignore it, the worse it gets. Yeah, well, you could say that about everything. Then you know it's true, said Neil, crossing his arms. Whatever, little brother, said Bree, spinning on her heels, walking briskly back toward the house. Who knows what's true anymore? Chapter 21. Later, Claire asked Neil and Bree to come to the pie shop with her. Anna had an 11 o'clock phone conference with the art gallery in Woodstock. Neil decided not to take it personally that Anna clearly wanted them out of her hair. It was just as well. He knew he needed to persuade his sister to help him do something about the strange occurrences, starting with convincing her that he wasn't insane. At least this way they'd be stuck together for the day. After breakfast, Neil had 20 minutes to get ready. In the upstairs bathroom, he turned on the faucet in the purple clawfoot tub, then twisted the asterisk-shaped knob above the silver spout so that a heavy stream sprayed from the showerhead. Before Neil even had a chance to strip off his shirt and sleep shorts, steam began to rise from the basin where the water was quickly collecting. The drain must be clogged, Neil thought, stepping into the hot, shallow pool. The previous night's dream flashed briefly through his mind, but then he remembered Bree's attempt to contact their father. His annoyance pushed any other anxiety aside. If Dad took them away, what would they do about the mystery of Nurse Janet? It would be much more difficult to learn the truth about the asylum in the woods all the way from California. Besides, according to Alexi and Mark, you can't escape a haunting. Spirits travel in the same way memories do, and Neil had been haunted by his parents ever since the beginning of the year. It didn't seem to matter where he went. Why was Bree insisting on being so blind? How come she refused to place blame where it belonged? Rick Cady, their father, had lost his job as a high school teacher 2 years ago. He'd looked for work every day until the daily grind grew too exhausting. Then he found solace in rehearsals for Annie Gets Your Gun, a local production in which he'd been cast as the male lead. It didn't bring him any money, but it made him happy. Everything changed when one night Rick came home late, missing dinner. He explained to his family that he'd met with a casting agent that afternoon in New York City. From the coldness that filled their house over the next few weeks, Neil understood that what was happening between his parents was not merely about acting. Months later, that same agent convinced Rick that Los Angeles was where he needed to be. Neil believed that everything that had happened since his father went away, this Nurse Janet's nonsense included, was his father's fault. The fact that Bree wouldn't admit it was a poisoned cherry on top of an already toxic sundae. Neil knew what Bree was thinking. Dad is the only sane parent we have left. But Neil wondered, what kind of sane person would leave his family suffering on one side of a continent to go off and pursue a fantasy on the other? Someone knocked on the bathroom door, snapping Neil back to reality. "We're heading out soon." It was Claire. The shower was all steam now. Neil glanced at his fingertips. They were pruning. "Sorry," Neil called out, beginning to rinse what was left of the shampoo suds from his hair frantically. "Give me a minute." Soapy white residue coated the surface of the water, which had risen halfway up his calves. Neil turned off the faucet, and the water slowed to a trickle from the spout. He swung the shower curtain open and reached for his towel, hanging on a nearby hook. Wiping his face, Neil felt something brush against his leg. Glancing down at the water, he noticed a ripple of minuscule waves bouncing off the far side of the basin, but the disturbance quieted as quickly as it had begun. The opaque water was difficult to see through, even when Neil bent over to get a closer look. Something long, thin, and dark squirmed just below the surface. Neil stood quickly, scrambling to leap from the water. His feet slipped out from under him. His knee hit the edge of the tub, and he toppled to the bathroom floor with a resounding crash. The plush purple bath mat broke his fall, but it didn't stop Claire from rushing back upstairs. She pounded on the door. Neil, are you okay? Neil's left shoulder and hip pulsed with a dull pain. He kneeled, his brain scanning the rest of his body. I tripped, he said, when he wasn't sure he hadn't broken any bones. Sorry, Aunt Claire. He cautiously peered over the edge of the tub. The water had dropped a couple inches and it cleared a bit. The bottom of the basin appeared to be empty. Whatever he'd seen moments ago had either been in his imagination or had slipped down the drain. Did you hurt yourself? He almost called out to tell Claire what he'd just seen, but the previous night's conversation rose up in his memory. I'm beginning to wonder if they wouldn't be better off with my brother in Jersey City. He didn't want to worry her any more than he already had. I'm fine. He wrapped the towel around him, swiftly wiping away the water that still clung to his skin. For goodness sake, be careful. By the time Neil was dry, the tub had fully emptied, and he forced himself to peer into the drain itself. The hole lacked a catch-all filter, so he was able to see directly into the pipe below. The water level hovered a few inches down, as if something was, in fact, keeping it from sinking. Closing his eyes and taking a deep breath, Neil reached down. Sticking his finger into the opening, he felt something slimy, somewhat fuzzy like an air clog. Gross yet familiar. He managed to catch part of it. He pulled. What came out of the hole made Neil faint. A long piece of dark green weed. The kind he dreamed about the night before. He dropped it into the tub, where it landed with a disheartening splat. Slipping quickly into his clothes, Neil went out into the hallway. Aunt Claire, Aunt Anna, he called out. Moments later, Claire peeked out from her bedroom door. Can you come here? He asked. Neil turned around and swung the bathroom door wide. There was another piece of lake grass, this time in the tub. I thought you said... But of course the tub was now empty. Of course. Claire raised an eyebrow, and Neil's skin prickled with embarrassment. The feeling reminded him of waking from the nightmare the night before. Sorry, he said quickly, hoping he hadn't just made things worse for himself. I guess I'm seeing things. Chapter 22. Neil and Bree rode silently in the back seat of Claire's car as he drove into Hedston. He did not speak of the bathroom again. When they arrived, the PieSop employees greeted them with enthusiasm. Neil asked Claire if he could use the Sop's phone. An hour later, Wesley arrived on his bike. The boy sat on the curb out front, about the lakeweed appearing and then disappearing. I'm getting sort of jealous, said Wesley. Why hasn't anything strange happened to me or Eric? You want strange? Neil raised an eyebrow. You can have some of mine. I don't know how much more I can take. Wesley kicked a pebble into a nearby storm drain. You guys can stay in my house if you want. We don't have a lot of room, but I'm sure my mom won't mind. This isn't about our house. Neil smacked Wesley's knee. It's about me and Bree. Besides, your mom doesn't even know us. I told her about you, though. She thinks it's great that we're hanging out. Other kids in this town, well, let's just say they think I'm a little weird. Neil managed to laugh. Only a little? Wesley thought about it too, then he laughed. Yeah, they haven't seen anything yet. Everyone can't be worried if you watch them long enough. A loud engine rumble echoed from around the shop. Seconds later, a large pickup truck roared out of Jameson Way, the thin alley-like road at the nearest corner, and screeched to a halt in front of them. Neil pulled his feet out of the front tire's path just in time. He was about to shout a piece of his mind when a familiar face peered down at him from the driver's window. Whoa there, said Andy. Almost got you, sir. Immediately, Neil felt bad for what he'd been thinking. Andy opened the door and stepped onto the curb. He held out both hands to the boys and helped them up. Neil, he said, shaking his head at what appeared to be astonishment. "You're just the person I was looking for, and hell was about to run you over." He pressed his lips together, sheepish. "Don't tell your aunts. They'll torture me." He nodded hello at Wesley. Wesley nodded back. "I won't say a word," said Neil, smiling slightly. "You were looking for me?" "I feel awful about the other night," said Andy. "At the party." Neil felt his lungs tighten. "I know you heard us all talking. I wanted to apologize." Neil didn't say a word. "Whatever's going on with your parents?" Andy stopped himself and glanced uncertainly at Wesley. "Your personal life is none of my business." He reached into the pocket of his jeans, pulled out a scrap of paper, and handed it to Neil. "But having gone through something similar in my own family, I wanted to let you know that if you ever wanted someone to talk to, someone other than your aunts, you can always call me." Neil opened the note to find that Andy had written his phone number. Andy really had been looking for him, and he'd come prepared. Neil felt his face flush. "I can meet you here, anytime." "Thanks," Neil heard himself say. He folded up the piece of paper and tucked it into the pocket of his shorts. "That's really nice of you." "I hope I'm not stepping on toes. I'm just close by, that's all." There was something in this old man's eyes, something sad, that reminded him of his family. It was the kind of thing he'd wished his father had said to him back when he was still around. Neil glanced down at his sneakers. "My toes are fine." Wesley laughed nervously. Andy smiled and then reached for the cafe door. Holding it open for them, he said, "Now, if I don't get some coffee in my stomach soon, you guys will see me turn into a monster. Not pretty, trust me." Chapter 23. After Andy took his extra large cup to go, the boys asked Claire if they could borrow her computer. They didn't mention that they planned on looking up as much as they could about the history of Graylock. "I need to play some artists for the shop," said Claire. "But your sister's heading over to the library. You guys can use the computers there instead. If you're back around 1, I'll make you some lunch." She didn't even hint that Neil's bathtub stunt that morning had freaked her out. Maybe he was in the clear? Bree insisted on walking 5 steps ahead of them. She hadn't said a word to Neil since their fight about their father. Yes, he wanted her help, but if she was so intent on leaving behind the haunts of Hedston, Neil couldn't force her. Let her read her romance novels. He and Wesley had work to do. The library was a few blocks ahead. It sat across the street from the expansive hillside view where Neil had first experienced Wesley's Green Man. 1 story tall, the building had been constructed in the 1930s from local stone of varying size and color. It reminded Neil of a life-sized gingerbread house in a fairy tale. He wondered how the town managed to fit an entire collection of books inside. As if reading his mind, Wesley said, "There's a big basement, totally creepy. The computers are down there." "Great," said Bree over her shoulder. "That's exactly where I won't be." As a car came up the street from behind them, the trio moved further away from the road. The small red hatchback slowed as it passed them, and someone shouted from the open window, "Hey, look! 2 freaks in the gate!" Then the car sped off, burping out a lick of grayish exhaust. "Eat dirt!" Wesley stepped forward and shouted. After the sputter of the engine disappeared past the top of the hill, Wesley realized that both Neil and Bree were staring at him in confusion. "Members of my brother's band," Wesley explained. "They've been harassing us the past few days." "That's terrible," said Bree, looking truly concerned. "Is Eric okay?" "Eric seems to be handling it fine," said Wesley. "And, I am too, in case you were wondering." He raised an eyebrow and Bree blushed. "Just gotta stand up for ourselves a little more now, but that's all right. I'm used to it even if Eric isn't." "What happened between them, Eric and the band, I mean?" Neil asked. "I'm sure it had something to do with the girl," Wesley said, rolling his eyes. "It always does." Bree cleared her throat and pulled a loose strand of hair behind her ears. "Well," she said in a strange, businesslike tone, "I hope he's able to sort it out." Yeah, me too, said Wesley. I'm all for prank calls and everything, but not when I'm the one who's getting them. I mean, I know what me and Eric are dealing with. It's nothing compared to the scary stuff that's happening to you guys, but... Bree cut him off with a deathly glance that told him she didn't want to talk about it. Let's just go. Once they reached the library steps, Neil said, the one question I have is, who of us are the freaks and which one's the geek? Personally, said Wesley, taking 2 steps at a time, I'd be proud to be called either. Chapter 24. The library was cool and dark, the exact opposite of the day they'd left behind outside. A circular wooden desk sat in front of the main entrance. A sign directed patrons to approach at the right for returns and to check out on the opposite side. A young man sitting at the front looked up from a book he'd been reading. Hi, Wesley, he said, smiling. He wore a rumpled, collared shirt and a 2-sorts tie, looking as if he'd raided his grandfather's wardrobe. Hi, Jay. These are my friends Neil and Bree. They're visiting from New Jersey. Welcome to Hedston, said Jay the librarian, in a way that hinted there was no way to feel welcome in this town. Try to make yourself comfortable. We're hanging down on the computers, said Wesley, grabbing Neil's elbow. Maybe you can tell Bree where to find the Remus novels? Bree's eyes went wide with embarrassment. Or anything, really, she said quickly. Fixin's over there, said Jay, nodding to the shelves near the back windows. Bree whispered to the boys, Come get me when you guys are done. Aunt Claire gave me her library card, Neil, so if there's a book you need, we can check it out together. On the lower level, 2 computers sat on a table behind the staircase. The room was damp and the lights were dim. There were no windows, just the building's stone foundation. Every few seconds, a squeak rose from a corner of the room. Someone was pushing a cart, reselling books. Otherwise, the boys seemed to have the entire floor to themselves. Thump! The cart must have crashed into one of the bookshelves. A soft voice said, Excuse me. Neil didn't know if the person speaking was talking to them or to the books. Let's look her up then, said Wesley. Who? Who else, Nurse Anna? But a quick internet search didn't give them much of a return. Several options for Janet Riley's, but none were nurses and none were in Hedston. Weird, said Neil. You'd think someone would have posted something about the legend somewhere. Wesley modified the search. He tried adding the words Graylock Hall, murder, suicide. Still, the search engine refused to cooperate. This is so strange, said Wesley. According to the interwebs, the Nurse Anna lady never existed. Oh, she existed, all right, said a voice behind them. The boys spun their chairs to find a tall, thin woman standing over them. She was dressed in a black jersey dress that was coated with strands of long white cat fuzz. Her gray hair was tied loosely into a lopsided bun on top of her head. Neil thought she looked familiar but didn't know why. In fact, she exists still, the woman went on, folding her arms, revealing sharp red fingernails. Despite the tall tales folks in this town tell, Nurse Janet Riley is very much alive. Chapter 25. We won't tell, said Wesley quickly. Promise. The woman stared at the boys in shock. Neil closed his eyes, mortified. The woman spoke. You think that I... Then she began to laugh. She laughed so hard she doubled over, hitching silent gasps before snorting loudly, which sent her into another round of high-pitched giggles. When she found the breath to speak again, she said, I'm not Shannon! Never have been and never will be. I'm Gladys. We met at the party. Neil nodded. When I'm not taking classes from your Aunt Anna, I volunteer here at the library. Keeps me cool. Gladys smiled.
Being mistaken for Miss Riley isn't the worst thing people have thought of me. Living in a small town like this, you can make enemies fairly quickly. Folks love to talk. I assume that's how the rumors of poor Janice started.
Is he still alive? Neil said in disbelief. This changed everything. The nightly visitor, the dream of drowning, the woman in white at the playground. If it wasn't the ghost of Nurse Jana, then who or what was it? Finding his voice again, Wesley asked, "Can you tell us anything about her?"
"I never met the woman myself. She was a friend of my older sister."
Gladys shoved the long black sleeves of her dress up her bony forearms, looking serious, as if she had been wanting to set the record straight for quite some time.
"I know the stories the kids tell in the school hallways. My nieces and nephews used to insist that Jana Riley was the boogeyman of Hinton, a vengeful spirit that would hide trespassers at the asylum in the woods. I think they just like to scare each other at slumber parties. They refuse to listen to the truth."
"Those stories are still around," said Neil, glancing harshly at Wesley, who shrugged apologetically.
"It's all very dramatic." Gladys nodded. "And everyone loves a good spook. Now, the truth of the matter is quite simple. There were several drownings out at Graylock. The state investigated. They shut the place down. Many people lost their jobs. Yes, there was some suspicion placed on the staff who worked in the youth ward, but nothing was ever proven. Jana Riley left this town in a smokescreen of accusation. Folks were so angry that she was able to simply walk away. It's no wonder they demonized her. Poor old thing."
"But what if she was guilty?" asked Wesley.
"That's not really for us to decide, is it?" said Gladys. "She was never charged with a crime."
Wesley said, "But that doesn't mean—" "Do you know where we can find her?" Neil interrupted. "Talk to her, maybe?" Gladys flinched, surprised.
"Now, why would you want to do a thing like that?"
Neil and Wesley looked at each other, silently trying to come up with an answer that would satisfy her. But Gladys only rolled her eyes.
"Oh, I know you boys went out to Graylock Hall this week. No need to lie, old Gladys. I was young once, too. You're curious about the ghost story. You want to outstand it yourself."
Neil's cheeks flushed, but he nodded anyway. "Please don't tell anyone." Gladys shrugged, teasing, pushing her book cart back into the shadows. The wheels whined in dismay.
"There's a retirement home several miles north," she said. "Whispering Knoll, I think it's called. Miss Riley lives there, but she didn't hear from me."
Chapter 26. After looking up the retirement home's phone number, the boys closed out of the internet and made their way back upstairs.
"Did you find what you were looking for?" Jay asked, still sitting behind the circular desk, his book in hand. "And more," said Wesley. Turning toward Neil, he whispered, "We should get to a phone. Maybe your aunt will let us use the one back at the shop." Neil nodded, even though he was almost terrified to find out what a living, breathing Nurse Shannon would have to say to them. Would she be angry? Would she hang up? He still couldn't believe she was really alive. Was Gladys telling the truth? Wesley went off to find the bathroom. "Ugh, come on!" came a voice from behind a bookshelf near the fiction section. Jay glanced at Neil. He raised an eyebrow. "She's been doing that for a while." Neil peeked around the corner and found Bree standing in a computer kiosk. She was looking through the electronic catalog. "What's the matter?" Bree stiffened, then turned. She shook her head and waved dramatically at the screen. "This stupid thing isn't working. I keep typing in book titles, and all that pops up are these weird screensavers, 3 pictures. When I move the mouse, they go away, but the computer won't let me look for my books." Neil's throat tightened. "What kind of pictures?" "I'll show you." Bree searched for a random title, and when she hit enter, a full-screen slideshow began. When Neil saw the first photograph, he covered his mouth in shock. It was the same picture he'd seen in the camera's view screen the day before. The taxidermic deer head. When the next photo popped up on the screen, Neil felt dizzy. The piano bench with a stack of sheet music. The third photo, birch logs in a fireplace, was no surprise. Bree stared at him, worried. Neil felt a hand on his shoulder. He jumped and spun around, lashing out, narrowly slapping Jay in the face. The librarian leaped backward. "Whoa!" he said. "I came to see if the catalog was giving you problems." "Sorry," said Neil. "I just thought—" "As a matter of fact," Bree said, turning back to the screen, "the catalog is giving us problems. A screensaver keeps popping up. The computer won't let me search." "This machine doesn't have a screensaver," said Jay, confused. "Well, look," said Bree. She went through the search process again, but this time, after she hit enter, the catalog showed her a list of titles similar to the ones she'd entered. No photos, no slideshow. "What the heck? It's not doing it now." Jay sighed and shrugged. "I'm not sure what to tell you, except that the VC Andrews books are all right behind you. That's what you were looking for, right?" Bree looked sheepish. "Yeah, thanks." On the walk back to the pie shop, Neil filled in Wesley about the 3 photos they'd encountered at the computer kiosk. "At first, I didn't realize that I was looking at the same pictures Neil saw yesterday," said Bree. "But when I saw Neil's reaction—" "It's like someone was able to tap into the devices," said Neil, "to show us something they wanted us to see. The antlers, the piano bench, and the fireplace." "But how is that possible?" asked Wesley. "Can you remotely manipulate a camera's memory card or a whole library catalog?" "Not that I've heard," said Bree. "You know what this means, right?" said Neil. "Bree and I have both dreamed of the lake. We've both seen the weeds, and now we both experienced the 3 photos. Eric's wrong. This is definitely not only in my imagination." Bree squinted, seeming to concentrate on the sidewalk ahead of her. "Someone wanted us to see these images. Us. And somehow they managed to make it happen." Neil remembered what Alexia Mark had said about the dead being able to use physical energy in order to show themselves to the living. Maybe the images were simply another way that the spirit, or whatever, was trying to communicate with them. But what was it trying to say? "The antlers, the piano bench, and the fireplace," Bree continued dreamily, seeing the images in her mind. "They've got to mean something. Maybe the pictures have to do with that Nurse Jana legend." "Yeah," said Neil slowly, cautiously, thinking about the news Gladys had revealed to them a few minutes ago. "About that."